Picture a torchlit hall in France 5 centuries ago, where a king named Francis holds court and a small, sharp-tongued jester called Triboulet waits near the throne. The music swells, the wine flows, and this jester, famous across the realm for his daring, decides, on this glittering evening, to attempt something no sane courtier ever would. As the king turns his back to speak with the duke, Triboulet creeps close, raises one hand and delivers a sharp slap squarely across the royal backside. For a heartbeat, the whole hall freezes. Then the nobles roar with laughter and King Francis spins around, his face somewhere between astonishment and rising fury. Striking a king was no small joke. It was the kind of thing that could end with a head parted from its shoulders before the candles guttered low. Yet Francis, half amused, offers a strange mercy. He will forgive the insult, he says, if the jester can invent an apology even more insulting than the slap itself. Triboulet bows very low, thinks for one dangerous moment and says, "Forgive me, sire, I truly did not recognize you. I mistook you for the queen." And there it is. The joke that went too far, because the one person in all of France a jester must never mock was the king's own wife. We will return to poor Triboulet later tonight, and to how he wriggled out of the noose his own wit had knotted, but hold that thought a while. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what the local time is where you are right now. So now, dim the lights low, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because tonight you're not staying home. You're stepping back into a world where laughter had teeth, where a joke could win you land or lose you your life. This is the strange history of medieval pranks, the practical jokes, the licensed chaos, the festivals of foolery, and the moments when all of it tipped over the edge. You should know right away that medieval people were not the grim, joyless figures you might imagine, shuffling through mud with never a smile to share. They loved a good trick as much as anyone alive today. They simply played their pranks in a world with far fewer soft edges and safety nets. A jest that we would post online and forget could, in their world, spark a brawl, a lawsuit, a church trial, or a very real feud between families. Historians still argue whether medieval humour was crueler than our own, or merely more honest about the cruelty that hides inside every really good laugh. Tonight you will meet kings who kept fools to insult them, choir boys dressed as bishops, and whole towns that banged pots to shame their neighbours. You will wander into a church where the clergy brayed like donkeys, and into a French court where a slap on the royal rump nearly cost a life. But let us begin gently at the root of it all with the oldest instinct behind every prank, the sheer delight of turning the world upside down. Long before there were knights or cathedrals, the Romans kept a midwinter festival called Saturnalia, a week when the ordinary rules of life were cheerfully suspended. During Saturnalia, masters waited on their own servants at table, gambling was allowed openly in the streets, and a mock king was crowned to preside over the nonsense. Everyone wore soft caps of freedom, gifts of candles and little clay dolls changed hands, and for a few bright days the bottom of society sat on top. When the Roman world slowly became Christian, the festival did not simply vanish. Its wild, upside-down spirit crept quietly into the long midwinter celebrations of medieval Europe. And so the instinct survived, that once a year, for a short and giddy season, the servant might mock the master, and the fool might wear the crown. You can already feel where this is heading, can't you? Hand a whole town permission to misbehave, and someone somewhere will take that permission much too far. That, in a sentence, is our theme tonight. The thin, laughing line between harmless mischief and the prank that leaves real damage behind it. Picture the medieval year as a great wheel, turning slowly through planting and harvest, through fasting and feasting, through long dark nights lit only by tallow and fire. Most of that year was work, hard, repetitive, back-bending work in fields and workshops, with little room for foolishness between sunrise chores and sunset exhaustion. But scattered across the calendar were the feast days, the holy days, the fairs, pockets of time when the ordinary rules loosened and mischief could breathe. The greatest of these loosenings came in the deep of winter, in the 12 days of Christmas, when cold and darkness pressed people indoors and together. It was then, in the smoky warmth of hall and tavern, that the season of misrule truly began, and that is exactly where we are going next. Imagine you're there, wedged onto a bench in a crowded hall, the fire snapping, the ale going round, the whole room warm and loud and gloriously off-duty. Someone bangs a tankard on the table and calls for a leader of the revels, a lord of the nonsense, chosen not by rank but by pure blind luck. A dried bean has been baked into a cake, and whoever finds that bean in his slice will rule this little kingdom of misbehaviour for the night. The cake is cut, the slices passed round, and every reveller chews with exaggerated care, half hoping and half dreading to feel that small hard bean. And when a shout goes up and the lucky fool holds the bean aloft, the whole hall roars its approval, for the Lord of Misrule has just been crowned. So there he stands, your new sovereign of silliness, a kitchen boy or a stable hand suddenly draped in borrowed finery and handed a wooden sceptre topped with a jingling bell. For the 12 days of Christmas, or however long the household allows, this ordinary man will command lords and ladies who, on any other day, would not notice he existed. In the great houses of England, the Lord of Misrule was no mere accident of a bean. Wealthy families and even kings appointed him deliberately and paid him well. At the Tudor court, the master of the revels chose a Lord of Misrule each Christmas, funding his mock reign with real money for costumes, players, and elaborate foolery. His first act, almost always, was to issue absurd decrees, and the joy of the game was that everyone, high and low, was bound to obey them. He might command a bishop to hop across the hall, order 2 knights to trade clothes, or sentence a countess to sing a silly song for her supper. Refuse the Lord of Misrule, and you might find yourself hauled before his mock court, tried by a jury of drunkards for crimes invented on the spot. The punishments were rarely cruel, at least in theory. A forfeit, a kiss, a comic penance, a ducking, or the wearing of some ridiculous hat for the evening. Historians still argue whether this was true rebellion in miniature, or merely a clever release valve, letting the poor blow off steam so they would behave the rest of the year. Whatever the truth, the sight of a servant lording it over his betters was electric, funny, and just a little dangerous, because everyone knew where the real power lay. The Lord of Misrule presided over the mummeries and masks, the dancing and dicing, the endless drinking, and the games that filled the long midwinter nights with noise. There were games we would still recognise: Blind Man's Buff, Hot Cockles, Hunt the Slipper, and dice thrown for stakes that grew wilder as the ale went down. And there were games we would not: mock weddings, mock funerals, mock trials, and elaborate practical jokes staged for the whole household to enjoy at some victim's expense. A favourite trick was to send a gullible newcomer on a fool's errand, sent to fetch some impossible thing while the whole hall waited to laugh at his return. He might be sent for a bucket of dry water, a length of striped paint, or the key to the belfry that, of course, had no lock at all. Another was the mock knighthood, where a boastful guest was solemnly dubbed with a wooden sword, then tipped backward off his stool into the rushes to roars of laughter. The rushes on the floor, by the way, hid all manner of dropped bones, spilled ale, and worse, so a fall into them was its own foul punishment. Under a bold Lord of Misrule, the whole house became a theatre of inversion, where dignity was the one thing no one was allowed to keep for long. Even the church could not fully escape him, for in some towns the misrule spilled out of the halls and into the streets, and sometimes into the chapels themselves. And here, gently, we begin to feel the edge of tonight's theme, because a game with no referee has a way of forgetting where it ought to stop. Give a man a paper crown and a room full of people who must obey him, and you have handed him a small, intoxicating taste of real power. Some lords of misrule wore that power lightly, bowing out with a wink when the season ended and returning without complaint to the stables or the scullery. Others did not, and the histories preserve grumbles about mock kings who grew too fond of the role, whose jokes bit too hard and lingered too long. There are records of feasts that ended in broken furniture, bloodied noses, and friendships soured by a jest that struck a nerve no one had meant to touch. For all its laughter, misrule ran on alcohol, and alcohol has never been famous for knowing when a joke has gone quite far enough for one night. Picture a hall near midnight. The fire burned low, the songs turned raucous, the mock king slurring his decrees, and the laughter taking on a harder, wilder edge. It is in that hour, when merriment tips toward mayhem, that a harmless season of misrule could curdle into something the sober morning would deeply regret. We will see shortly a very real example of exactly that, when the students of a London law school took the Christmas games a great deal too seriously. But first, savour the better side of it. The genuine warmth of a custom that for a few nights let everyone forget the crushing weight of their station. For a scullion who spent the year being shouted at, to sit in the master's chair and be waited upon must have felt like a small, delicious miracle. For the master, meanwhile, there was a rough wisdom in it. A lord who could laugh at himself, even briefly, earned a loyalty that fear alone never could. So the Lord of Misrule was both a joke and a lesson, a release and a warning, a reminder that every crown, even a real one, is only cloth and metal. And when the 12th night finally came, the paper crown was surrendered, The sceptre laid down and the ordinary world clicked quietly back into its familiar shape. The kitchen boy became a kitchen boy again, the countess a countess, and everyone pretended more or less that the past 12 days had never happened at all. But the memory lingered, as such things do, warm and slightly wicked, carried in grins exchanged across the hall long after the decorations came down. So let us follow those high spirits out of the manor and into the city, to a London law school where one Christmas the games of misrule went badly, expensively wrong. So follow me now out of the warm manor hall and across frozen London to one of the great inns of court, where young men studied the law and apparently mischief. Lincoln's Inn was a serious place, a nursery of lawyers and judges, but at Christmas even serious places elected a lord of misrule and let the season off its leash. In the winter of 1516, the revels there fell under the sway of a student remembered only by the nickname Jack Straw, a name borrowed from an old rebel. Under this Jack Straw, the Christmas games at Lincoln's Inn grew wilder and wilder, until the pranks stopped being funny and started being expensive. The records speak of damage to property, of disorder that overran the bounds of the season, of high spirits that curdled into something closer to a riot. What exactly Jack Straw and his followers smashed we do not fully know, but the governors of the inn were angry enough to write it down and to act. The offending Lord of Misrule was, in effect, deposed and disciplined, a reminder that even licensed chaos had a limit the authorities would defend. It is a small incident, easy to overlook, but it captures our whole theme in miniature. A game of misrule that forgot it was only a game, and Lincoln's Inn was far from alone, for wherever young men gathered in numbers, the line between festive prank and genuine disorder grew thin and easy to cross. Consider the universities, those crowded, competitive hothouses of clever, bored and frequently drunk young scholars, packed together far from the eyes of their families. At Oxford, at Paris, at Bologna, the students had their own traditions of misrule, and their pranks could be spectacular, offensive, and occasionally dangerous. Chroniclers describe scholars parading through the streets with their faces smeared in mud and even dung, howling mockery at their professors and masters. They lampooned the great and the good with cheerful cruelty, jeering at priests, at officials, at magistrates, and when they dared, at kings themselves. There was cross-dressing and wild singing. There was drinking that started early and ended badly, and there were processions that blurred the line between parade and mob. The freshmen, the newcomers, suffered the worst. For initiation into student life often meant enduring humiliating pranks that we would now call, frankly, hazing. A new arrival might be made to wear horns to be symbolically hunted as a wild beast, then shaved, doused, and forced to buy drinks for his tormentors. Historians still argue whether these rituals built genuine fellowship among scholars, or simply taught the young that power means being cruel to whoever arrived most recently. Whatever their purpose, the town rarely found them funny, and the great rivalry between town and gown turned many a student prank into a bloody street battle. The scholars felt themselves above the ordinary townsfolk disagreed heartily, and a jeering procession could ignite into brawling in the space of a breath. At Oxford, tensions of exactly this kind erupted over the years into riots that left men dead, taverns wrecked, and the whole city under a bitter cloud. What might begin as a prank, a mocking song, a shoved shoulder, an insult flung across a market could end with knives drawn and blood on the cobbles. This is the shadow side of the festive spirit. The moment when the license to misbehave becomes a license that no one remembers granting or knows how to revoke. The authorities, church and crown alike, watched all this with mounting unease, for a population practised in mockery is a population harder to keep in line. A servant who has worn the master's crown even in play has imagined a world turned upside down, and imagination once lit is a difficult fire to put out. And so the records fill across the centuries with statutes and sermons and stern decrees, all trying to fence in the wilder edges of festive misrule. Mayors banned masks, bishops forbade the mummeries, colleges disciplined their lords of misrule, and yet year after year the season returned and the games began again. There is something almost touching in that stubbornness, in the way ordinary people clung to their few days of licensed nonsense against the disapproval of every authority above them. For most, it never went too far. Most revels ended in nothing worse than a headache, a lost wager, and a warm memory to carry through the grey months. But the incidents that did go too far are the ones that reach the records, because damage and disorder are what magistrates trouble themselves to write down. So we are left with a slightly skewed history, one that remembers the riots and forgets the 1,000 quiet nights of harmless, happy, forgettable fun. Keep that in mind as we travel tonight, that behind every scandalized chronicle lies a great silent majority who simply laughed, and drank and went peacefully to bed. Still, it is the spectacular failures that teach us most, the pranks that leapt the fence, because they show us precisely where medieval people themselves drew the line. And nowhere was that line more startling, more strange to modern eyes, than the places where the pranking was led not by peasants or students, but by priests. Still, the scandals are our road tonight, and they lead us onward, from the rowdy law students of London back toward the candlelit hush of the medieval church. Because the most astonishing misrule of all did not happen in taverns or lecture halls, but inside cathedrals, performed by the very men who are meant to keep them holy. Imagine walking into your parish church on a bright winter morning, expecting solemn prayer, and finding instead a boy in a bishop's mitre preaching from the pulpit. Imagine a few days later returning to find grown clergymen braying like donkeys, dancing in the aisles and gambling with dice upon the high altar itself. That is where we go next, into the strange, half-holy, half-riotous world of the boy bishop and the notorious Feast of Fools. So step with me now through the great west door of a medieval cathedral, out of the cold and into a hush of stone, candle smoke and coloured light. It is early December, the 6th day, the feast of St. Nicholas, the gentle patron saint of children, of sailors, and of secret midnight gifts. On this day, in cathedrals and grammar schools across England and much of Europe, something delightfully strange is about to happen among the choir boys. From their ranks, the boys will choose one of their own to become for a little while a bishop, complete with robes, ring, mitre, and staff. He is called the boy bishop, the episcopus choristarum, the chorister bishop, and for 3 weeks he will hold a mock office that everyone treats with surprising seriousness. Tradition held that he should be a boy beautiful in body and clear of voice, chosen as much for grace as for the luck of the draw. The moment he's elected, the world tilts, for the boys of the choir now outrank the grown canons who days ago ruled their every waking hour. The little bishop is vested in a real mitre-size down for his head, a tiny cope of rich brocade and a crozier he can barely lift. His fellow choir boys become his canons and chaplains, solemn in miniature, processing behind him with all the gravity their small faces can command. And the adult clergy, the deans and canons who normally lord it over the choir, must now take the lowly seats and let the children preside. Picture it. A boy of perhaps 10, mitre slipping over his eyes, leading a full cathedral procession, while bearded priests shuffle meekly in the rear. He gives blessings, he leads certain services, and in many places he even climbs the pulpit to preach a sermon, sometimes written for him, sometimes his own. Crowds gathered to hear these boy sermons, and some were carefully preserved, little masterpieces of piety and cheek written to be spoken in a child's high voice. The gifts and coins they gathered were no trifle. They helped fund the choir itself, so the boys' brief reign paid, quite literally, for their singing. At Salisbury, a small stone monument is said to mark a boy bishop who died while still in office, a poignant reminder that these little prelates were real children. It is easy to laugh at a 10-year-old in a mitre, but the custom carried real tenderness, a whole society agreeing for once to kneel before a child. The boy bishop and his retinue would then process out through the town, visiting houses, collecting gifts and money for the church, and being feasted along the way. Everywhere they went, adults bowed, offered coins, and played along, treating the child with a tenderness that says something lovely about how medieval people saw childhood. Historians still argue over what it all meant, whether it was pure devotion to the innocence of children or a cheeky inversion smuggled in under holy cover. Probably it was both at once, a genuine reverence for childish purity wrapped around the same delicious thrill of the small suddenly outranking the great. For the boys themselves it must have been intoxicating. 3 weeks of honour, sweets, and the rare joy of watching their stern masters obey them. There were rules, of course, meant to keep the fun from souring, forbidding the boys from lingering too long at feasts or wandering the streets too late. But rules and children have never mixed perfectly, and there are hints that some boy bishops, drunk on brief power, pushed their luck a little too far. In some places, the collecting of gifts shaded into something more like demanding, with the boy bishop's retinue growing rowdy and grasping as they toured the town. And in the wrong hands, the mockery of the clergy sharpened, the child's sermon turning from gentle piety into pointed satire of the very men who taught him. Yet for the most part it stayed sweet, a beloved custom that ran in England, until the storms of the Reformation swept so many old traditions away. King Henry VIII banned the boy bishop. That ban was lifted under his Catholic daughter Mary, and then it vanished again under Elizabeth. So this small, strange, tender inversion died not from any scandal of its own, but because the whole world that had cradled it was changing. It is worth pausing on because it shows that medieval misrule was not always drunken and dangerous. Sometimes it was a child in an oversized mitre, blessing his elders. Sometimes turning the world upside down meant nothing more menacing than letting the least important person in the room be, for a moment, the most important. There is a whole philosophy hidden in that, a yearly reminder that greatness and smallness are mostly matters of costume and circumstance, easily swapped and easily returned. The boy who had been a bishop went back to being a boy, scolded again, drilled again, ranked again at the very bottom of the cathedral's order. But he would remember all his life, the weeks when the great men bowed to him, and perhaps that memory made the ordinary years easier to bear, and the custom of the boy bishop was only the gentler cousin of a wilder, stranger festival that seized the grown clergy at the very same season. For if the choir boys could play at being bishops, the junior clergy, the sub-deacons and minor priests, had a game of their own, and theirs was far less tame. Where the boy bishop charmed, their festival scandalized. Where he blessed, they burlesqued. Where he was sweet, they were riotous, and sometimes genuinely profane. It had many names across Europe, but the one that stuck, the one that still raises eyebrows, was simply the Feast of Fools. So keep your seat here in the cool of the cathedral, and let the candles burn a little lower, because the mood is about to change. The reverent hush of the boy bishop's procession is about to give way to the bray of a donkey led up the sacred aisle. The Feast of Fools took place in the deep midwinter, in the days around the New Year, and it belonged to the lowest ranks of the clergy. All year, the subdeacons and minor clerks had stood at the bottom of the church's rigid ladder, ordered about by deacons, priests, canons, and bishops above them. But for this one feast, the ladder was turned upside down, and the least of the clergy became, for a day, the greatest. They elected from among themselves a mock leader, a bishop of fools, or in France sometimes a pope of fools, and crowned him with borrowed splendour. This lord of holy misrule was dressed in full pontifical robes, given a crozier and a ring, and installed on the bishop's own throne with mock ceremony. From that throne he presided over a service that was part worship, part parody, and part sheer riotous fun, conducted inside the consecrated church. The liturgy was twisted into comedy. Sacred chants sung with nonsense words, solemn responses replaced with brays, hoots, and howls that echoed up the stone vaults. At the heart of it, in many places, stood a donkey, led right up to the altar in memory of the beasts of the Nativity and the flight into Egypt. This gave rise to the famous Mass of the Ass, in which the congregation answered the prayers not with amen, but with a hearty, drawn-out bray. Imagine a whole church full of clergy and townsfolk braying like donkeys in unison, the sound rolling and rebounding beneath the holy arches. Incense, that most sacred of scents, was mocked too, for the censers were sometimes filled with old shoe leather or worse, sending up a foul black smoke. Dice were rattled and thrown upon the altar, that most sacred of tables and sausages and puddings were eaten where the holy bread should rightly lie. The fools wore their vestments inside out or back to front, held their prayer books upside down, and pretended to read from them with grave, scholarly frowns. Some daubed their faces with soot or paint, some dressed as women, some as beasts, capering through the aisles in a whirl of colour and noise. Historians still argue about how far the profanity really went, since most of what survives was written by outraged churchmen with every reason to exaggerate. Were the wildest accounts sober reporting or scandalized rumour? We cannot be certain, but even the tamer descriptions are startling enough to raise a modern eyebrow. What is clear is that this was not some secret heresy, but an open, tolerated, even expected part of the Christmas season in countless churches. For a few dizzy hours, the awful distance between a humble subdeacon and God's majesty on earth was gleefully, deliberately, thunderously collapsed. And then, when the feast was over, everyone tidied up, put the vestments back the right way round, and returned to the deadly serious business of salvation. It is tempting to see it as pure blasphemy, but that misses the strange logic that made it possible in a deeply, genuinely religious age. The idea, roughly, was that once a year you could turn the sacred order upside down precisely to remind everyone how right side up it was meant to be. By playing the fool in God's house, the clergy acted out the truth that all human dignity is folly beside the divine, that even bishops are dust. At least that was the charitable reading, the one defenders offered when the bishops came calling with their frowns and their threats of punishment. The less charitable reading was that a year of enforced obedience and celibacy had built up a pressure that had to escape somewhere, and this was the vent. Probably, as ever, it was a tangle of both, genuine theology and genuine mischief braided so tightly that no one could quite pull them apart. What we can say is that people loved it, clung to it, and defended it fiercely for centuries against a church hierarchy that increasingly wanted it gone. In the town of Sens, in France, a beautiful office for the feast survives, complete with music, showing that some clergy took even their foolery seriously. It contains the famous donkey hymn, The Prose of the Ass, a genuinely lovely tune sung in praise of the humble beast, half devotion and half joke. That single detail captures the whole thing, a hymn both sincere and absurd, sung to a donkey standing in a cathedral, by men who meant it and mocked it at once. The signal for the chaos to begin was often a single line from the evening psalms, "He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and exalted the humble." On that cue, the precentor's staff of office was literally handed down to a lowly clerk, a small gesture that unleashed a very large night of misrule. At Beauvais, the celebration grew into its own Feast of the Ass in January, with a donkey and rider brought right inside the church to loud, joyful song. But not everyone was charmed, and to the higher clergy watching their sacred rites turned into a carnival, the Feast of Fools looked less like devotion and more like danger. They saw the dice on the altar, smelled the burning leather, heard the braying under the vaults, and they did not laugh. They reached for their pens, for a church that staked everything on the awe and mystery of its rituals, letting those rituals be mocked, even in fun, felt like playing with fire. And so, across the later Middle Ages, a long, slow campaign began to stamp the Feast of Fools out, church by church and decree by decree. It would take centuries, and stubborn resistance, and more than one furious document before the braying finally fell silent beneath the arches for good. We will follow that campaign shortly, and meet the bishops and scholars who set themselves against the fun with such determined disapproval. But first, let us linger just a little longer inside the feast itself, and watch one of its wildest, most infamous customs unfold in the candlelight. So the feast, having turned the church inside out, rarely stayed politely indoors, for the fools soon spilled through the great doors and into the open streets. Out they came into the winter daylight, a ragged, painted, braying parade, the mock bishop borne high, blessing the crowd with a mockery of sacred gestures. Behind him rolled carts, and on those carts sat more fools, flinging handfuls of grain, of bran, and sometimes of far less pleasant substances at the laughing onlookers. In some towns the clergy rode through the streets in tumbrils, hurling filth and dung at the crowd who gave every bit as good as they got. It was, in a sense, the birth of the carnival, that great pre-Lenten explosion of misrule that still survives in cities around the world today. The logic was seasonal. Before the long fasting of Lent, you emptied the larder and the spirit alike, gorging and joking until there was nothing left to give up. So the Feast of Fools flowed into a wider current of winter carnival, of feasting and masking and mockery that ran from Christmas toward the ashes of Lent. One of its strangest fruits was the Sermon Joyeux, the joyful sermon, a comic parody of a real sermon delivered with a straight face from the pulpit. A mock preacher would take a nonsense text, perhaps the life of a made-up saint, and expound it with all the solemn cadences of genuine holy oratory. There were sermons in praise of drunkards, sermons on the martyrdom of St. Ham and St. Sausage, sermons that sound, frankly, a great deal like modern stand-up comedy. The congregation, in on the joke, would groan and cheer and heckle, and the whole sacred architecture of the sermon was turned gently into a music hall turn. Historians still argue whether these comic sermons were harmless fun or a slow acid, quietly teaching congregations to find the real sermons just a little bit ridiculous too. Alongside the sermons came mock relics and mock pardons, fools solemnly selling splinters of Noah's Ark or the feathers of the angel Gabriel to a giggling crowd. This was sharper than it looks, for the real trade in relics and indulgences was one of the medieval church's most lucrative and least defensible businesses. To parody it, even in fun, was to poke at a very tender spot, and some of those jokes would echo a century later in the anger of the Reformation. But in the moment it was all laughter, the whole town given license to say the unsayable and mock the unmockable for a few short, giddy days. Picture the square at the height of it. Masks everywhere, a fool on stilts, a mock bishop dispensing nonsense blessings, music, smoke, and the roar of a crowd off its leash. Children darted underfoot, dogs barked at the donkeys, old women shrieked with laughter, and for a day the rigid medieval world dissolved into pure chaotic delight. And yet, threaded through the fun, there was always that edge, the sense that a crowd this size, this drunk, this excited, might tip at any moment into something darker. A mocking song aimed at an unpopular official could become a shove. The shove a blow, the blow a brawl, and the carnival curdle into a genuine riot. There are records of exactly this, of festival days that ended not in happy exhaustion, but in wrecked houses, settled scores, and the occasional corpse. For Carnival was also quietly a chance to do in disguise what you could never do barefaced: to insult, to threaten, to pay back an old grudge behind a mask. The mask is the crucial thing, for a masked man is briefly no one, freed from his name, his rank, and the ordinary fear of being held to account. We will come back to those masks and to the dark deeds they sometimes hid later tonight, for they are among the pranks that went furthest of all. But the church authorities did not need a riot to be alarmed. The mere sight of the sacred being mocked was to them quite bad enough. Every year the bishops watched their subordinates bray and caper, and every year a few more of them decided that the joke had gone on far too long. It was one thing to allow a boy in a mitre to bless the faithful. It was quite another to watch dice rattle across the altar of God. And so, the mood among the powerful slowly shifted, from amused tolerance to grumbling unease, to open, determined hostility toward the whole tradition of holy folly. The reformers had a genuine point, of course, one that even a lover of a good prank must concede if he is honest with himself tonight. A religion cannot survive if its holiest moments become punchlines, or, once laughed away, is very hard to summon back to the same hushed pitch again. The defenders of the feast had their answer, that a faith strong enough to laugh at itself was stronger, not weaker, than one too brittle to bear a joke. It is an old argument, older than the Middle Ages and younger than today, and you can hear its echo in every quarrel over what we are allowed to mock. Historians still argue about who had the better case, the fools or the reformers, and the honest answer is probably that both were right at once. The fools were right that laughter is holy. The reformers were right that some things break when you laugh at them too hard, too often, too long. And it was the reformers in the end who won, though it took them the better part of 3 centuries to finally silence the braying for good. So let's leave the roaring square now, and step into the quiet, cold rooms where the powerful sharpened their pens against the fun. Let us meet the bishops of Paris, the councils of the church, and the stern university masters who set themselves, with real determination, against the feast of fools. Because the story of how the laughter was finally stopped is every bit as revealing, in its own way, as the story of the laughter itself. The campaign against the Feast of Fools was not a single decree, but a long war of attrition, fought over centuries by bishops, councils, and scholars who simply would not laugh. One of the earliest and most famous shots was fired in Paris in the year 1199 by the Bishop Eudes de Sully at the great Cathedral of Notre Dame. Eudes did not try to ban the feast outright, for he was wise enough to know that a custom so beloved could not simply be ordered out of existence. Instead, he tried to tame it, drawing up careful rules to keep the celebration within bounds, to let the fun continue while stripping away its worst excesses. He permitted the feast to go on, but insisted the sacred vessels be locked safely away, and that the wildest profanities be curbed before they defiled the altar. It was a compromise, a reasonable man's attempt to leave the people their joy while protecting the dignity of the holiest things from the rowdiest hands. And like most reasonable compromises in the face of a good party, it worked only partly, and only for a while, before the old excesses crept back in. For the deeper truth was that you cannot half permit misrule. The whole point of the thing was to break the rules, and a rule-bound misrule is no misrule at all. So the feast rolled on, decade after decade, and the complaints piled up in the records, growing sharper and more exasperated with every passing generation. The great church councils began to take notice, and in 1431 the Council of Basel condemned the Feast of Fools in the strongest possible terms. This was no local grumble, but a pronouncement of the universal church, declaring the whole tradition of clerical foolery an intolerable abuse of sacred space. A few years later, in 1444, the theological faculty of the University of Paris issued its own furious, closely argued denunciation of the feast. This document is a remarkable thing, for in it the scholars actually quote the defenders of the feast, and then set out to demolish their arguments one by one. The defenders had claimed, you will remember, that folly was a necessary release, that the barrel of human nature must be allowed now and then to vent its pressure. The Paris theologians answered that this was nonsense, that you do not honour God by mocking him, and that no amount of pent-up pressure excuses profaning the altar. It is a genuinely powerful piece of writing, and reading it now you can feel the exasperation of serious men watching something sacred treated as a joke. Yet even the massed authority of Basel and Paris could not kill the feast at a stroke, for custom is a stubborn, deep-rooted and slippery thing. Bishops would ban it, and the people would revive it. A new bishop would relent, and the fools would caper again beneath the same old arches. In some places the feast simply changed its shape. sliding out of the cathedral and into the Guildhall, the tavern, and the open street to escape the church's reach. In others, it clung on inside the church itself, tolerated by a weary local clergy who found it easier to allow the fun than to fight their whole town over it. Historians still argue about why it took so very long to stamp out, and the likeliest answer is simply that people loved it and would not let it go. A custom that gives the powerless a taste of power, and the constrained a night of freedom is not surrendered easily, however many decrees are hurled against it. Slowly, though, the world that had made the feast began to change, and the change did more to end it than any council ever could. The Reformation split the church, and the Reformers, Protestant and Catholic alike, shared a new hunger for order, sobriety, and a religion scrubbed clean of medieval clutter. To the reforming mind, the Feast of Fools was everything wrong with the old church at once. Superstitious, disorderly, irreverent, and embarrassingly unforgivably fun. And so, church by church and town by town, the braying finally began to fall silent. The donkeys were led away, and the mock bishops hung up their borrowed mitres. It was a slow death, lingering in stubborn corners of France well into the 1600s, but a death nonetheless, and by then the world had moved on. Something was lost when the last Feast of Fools ended, though it is hard to say exactly what, and easy to overstate it into false nostalgia. Perhaps it was simply this: a formal, shared, communal permission to be ridiculous together, granted by the very institution that ruled the rest of your life. We still have our carnivals and our comedy, of course, but they no longer happen inside the cathedral, blessed and led by the priests themselves. The sacred and the silly, once so tightly braided, have been carefully separated, each sent to its own corner, and perhaps both are a little poorer for it. Or perhaps the reformers were simply right, and some things really are too important to be laughed at, and the loss was a price worth paying for reverence. Historians still argue over it, as they argue over everything, and tonight, drowsy and warm, you are free to take whichever side pleases you most. But before we leave the church behind entirely, notice one last thing about all this holy foolery that will matter for the rest of our journey. In every case, the prank was licensed, expected, framed by ritual and hedged by custom, a wildness carefully caged within a single season of the year. The trouble came, always, when someone forgot the frame, when the joke slipped its leash and became not play acting but the real thing, with real consequences. And nowhere was that danger sharper than in the person of the professional joker himself. The man paid, all year round, to say the unsayable to the powerful. So let us leave the cathedrals now, and make our way to the warm, dangerous heart of the medieval court to meet the jester. The court jester is one of those figures everyone thinks they know. The capering man in the cap and bells, and almost everything you picture is at least half true. He went by many names across medieval Europe: the fool, the jester, the joculator, the buffoon, the man whose entire profession was to amuse the powerful. And amusing the powerful, it turns out, was one of the most delicate and dangerous jobs a medieval person could possibly hold. To understand why, you first have to understand that there were roughly two very different kinds of fool kept at medieval and Renaissance courts. The first was the natural fool, a person born with some mental difference or disability, kept partly for amusement and partly in the better households out of a rough kind of care. Our modern instinct is to wince at this, and rightly, for there was real cruelty in laughing at a vulnerable person kept as a living plaything. Yet the natural fool also occupied a strangely protected place, cherished by some masters, mourned when they died, and shielded from a world that would otherwise have devoured them. Historians still argue about how to judge it, whether these fools were exploited victims, valued members of the household, or, confusingly, both at the very same time. The second kind was the artificial fool, the licensed fool, a sharp and clever performer who only pretended to be simple, and whose foolery was a carefully honed art. This is the jester of legend, the witty, acrobatic, quick-tongued entertainer who sang and tumbled, juggled and mimicked, and above all joked his way into the king's favour. He wore the famous motley, a coat of clashing colours, often parti-coloured, split down the middle into two hues, green and yellow, red and blue. On his head sat the cap, the coxcomb, its three drooping points tipped with little bells, said to mock the crown, the mitre, and the ass's ears all at once. In his hand he carried a bauble, or mahout, a short stick topped with a carved fool's head, a tiny mirror of himself with which he held mock conversations. Thus armed with bells and bauble, the jester enjoyed a privilege granted to almost no one else in the kingdom, the right to say what everyone else was thinking. He could mock the king's vanity, needle his ministers, puncture the pomp of visiting ambassadors, and speak blunt truths that would cost any courtier his head. This was the jester's real value, greater even than his juggling, for a powerful man surrounded by flatterers is a powerful man slowly going blind. Everyone around the king lied to him, agreed with him, and told him he was wonderful because their careers, and sometimes their lives, depended upon it. The fool alone was licensed to tell him the truth, wrapped in a joke, so that the medicine of honesty could be swallowed without choking on the pride. A good jester was, in effect, a court's conscience in bells, a way for hard truths to reach the throne along the one safe channel left open to them. Kings understood this, and the wisest of them valued their fools accordingly, listening for the sharp grain of sense hidden inside the nonsense. But the privilege had a price, and the price was danger. For the line between a joke the king enjoyed and a joke that enraged him was thin and always moving. If the fool judged the mood right, he was rewarded. If he judged it wrong, he might be whipped, dismissed, imprisoned, or, in the worst cases, worse. For the same license that let him speak truth to power also placed him, daily, within arm's reach of power's temper and power's whims. A king in a good mood would laugh at a jibe about his gout. The same king, gout flaring, might have the same jester flogged for the same joke. And so the jester learned to read a room the way a sailor reads the sky, feeling for the shift in the air before the storm broke over his head. He learned when to press and when to soften, when a truth could be told and when it must be swallowed, when to caper and when to kneel. It was a tightrope walked in bells, over a floor that could open at any moment, and the best jesters walked it for decades and died in their beds. The worst, or the unluckiest, misjudged a single joke and paid for it in ways that make our modern fear of a bad review look rather quaint. Historians still argue about how much real influence these fools truly had, whether they shaped policy or merely decorated it with clever noise. Some clearly mattered, trusted confidants who could calm a raging monarch when every counsellor had failed, worth more to the realm than a dozen dukes. Others were simply entertainers, gifted and beloved but no more powerful than a fine musician, valued for their art and nothing grander. But all of them, great and small, lived by the same strange bargain. Total license to offend, paid for with total vulnerability to the offended. It is a bargain that tells us something deep about power, about how the mighty have always needed and feared the one person allowed to laugh at them. Tonight we will meet several of these remarkable men and watch what happened when their jokes landed and what happened when their jokes did not. We will meet a jester who won a manor with a single unrepeatable talent, and another whose wit saved his neck from the noose it had earned. We will meet the fool who called a terrifying king by his first name and lived, and was perhaps the only person that king ever truly trusted. But let us begin with the strangest of them all, a man whose entire fortune rested on a single, spectacularly undignified annual performance. His name was Roland, and history remembers him to this very day, with a straight face and an entirely accurate title, as Roland the Farter. Roland lived in the 12th century in the England of King Henry II, a fierce and brilliant monarch, better known for his quarrels than his sense of humour. And yet this same King Henry kept among his entertainers a man whose single, remarkable talent has made him immortal in a way few kings ever manage. Roland's gift, put as delicately as history will allow, was an extraordinary and highly disciplined mastery of the art of breaking wind. Now before you laugh, and you may certainly laugh, understand that professional flatulence was, in the medieval world, a genuine and respected branch of entertainment. Such performers had a name, the bragetois, and their skill was ranked alongside that of musicians, for both, after all, were arts of controlling the breath and the body. Roland, it seems, was the finest of his kind, and his signature performance was a single, precisely choreographed feat that he delivered once a year. Every Christmas, before the assembled court of the King of England, Roland was required to perform what the records solemnly describe in careful Latin. The phrase, preserved in a genuine medieval document, was unum saltum et siffletum et unum bumbalum, one jump, one whistle, and one fart performed together. Read that again and let it settle. A leap into the air, a whistle from the lips, and a report from the other end, all at the very same instant. It was, in its way, a feat of remarkable coordination, a three-part harmony of the human body performed for the most powerful man in the land. And for this, for one perfectly timed Christmas performance a year, Roland the Farter was paid in a currency almost beyond a commoner's dreams. He was granted a manor, the manor of Hemingstone in the county of Suffolk, along with something like 30 acres of good English land. This was not a handful of coins tossed to a busker. This was real property, real status, the kind of holding that lifted a family for generations. Roland held his land by a form of tenure historians call sergeanty, meaning he owed the crown not rent or military service, but a specific personal duty. In Roland's case, that duty, written into the very terms of his landholding, was to appear each Christmas and perform his famous jump, whistle, and fart. Imagine it. A legal document, sworn and sealed, in which a man's title to his home rests upon an annual act of spectacular deliberate flatulence. His holding is recorded in a real and sober English administrative document, the Liber Feodorum, the Book of Fees, where clerks noted who held what and why. There, among the knights and barons and their solemn obligations, sits Roland, immortalised forever by the crown's own bookkeeping for a fart. Historians still argue over some of the details, over exactly how much land he held and whether the accounts grew in the retelling over the centuries, but the core of the story sits in genuine records, and it tells us something wonderful about the medieval world we so often imagine as grim and joyless. This was a society that could laugh, that prized skilled entertainment of every kind, and that was willing to pay a master of even the lowest comedy like a lord. There is a real tenderness in it too, the thought of a fierce king setting aside his cares each Christmas to howl with laughter at a well-timed noise. For all his wars and his rages, Henry II, it seems, enjoyed a good fart joke as much as any schoolboy, and paid handsomely for the very best. And Roland, for his part, played the long game with genius, turning a talent most people hide into a hereditary estate for his descendants. For the land, once granted, could be passed down, and the duty passed with it, meaning Roland's heirs inherited both the manor and the obligation to perform. One imagines the family's mixed feelings, generation after generation, at a Christmas duty that was equal parts honour and profound public embarrassment. At some point, unsurprisingly, the tradition seems to have quietly lapsed, the performance judged perhaps too undignified to continue at a more decorous court. But the land remained, and the record remained, and so Roland the Farter jumped, whistled, and thundered his way into the permanent memory of history. Now, was this a prank that went too far? In one sense, gloriously no. It went exactly as far as it needed to and was richly rewarded for it. But in another sense, it shows us the outer edge of medieval humour, the sheer, uninhibited delight in the body and its noises that we have since learned to hide. Our own comedy has grown politer, or at least more coy, and a modern king would not, one assumes, grant an earldom for a Christmas fart. Something has been gained in that dignity, no doubt, but something has also been lost, a certain frank, unashamed, belly-laughing honesty about being a mere animal. The medieval world laughed at the body loudly and without apology, because the body, in all its absurd and leaky glory, was simply a fact of every single life. Roland's fart, echoing down 8 centuries, is a reminder that our ancestors were not solemn statues, but living, laughing, gloriously earthy people just like us. And it reminds us too that a prank need not be cruel to be immortal. Roland hurt no one, mocked no one, and still earned a place in history. His was the happiest kind of foolery, the kind that harms nothing and delights everyone, the kind that ends not in a noose but in a deed to a manor. But not every jester was so lucky, and not every joke ended in land and laughter, for the fool's privilege, as we have seen, cut both ways. So let us leave Roland to his well-earned Suffolk fields, and turn to a jester whose jokes carried a much sharper edge and a much greater risk. The jester we turn to now lived in France, some centuries after Roland, in an age of splendid, ruthless kings and courts that glittered like knives. His name was Triboulet, and he served not one but 2 kings of France, first the cautious Louis XII, and then the dazzling, dangerous Francis I. Triboulet was, by every account, a small man, hunched and sharp-featured, the kind of figure a cruel age was quick to mock and quick to underestimate. But inside that unpromising frame lived one of the fastest, boldest, most fearless wits ever to ring a bell in a royal hall. Where Roland delighted with his body, Triboulet wounded with his tongue, and his jokes drew blood as often as laughter, sometimes from very powerful men. This was the sharper, riskier kind of foolery, the kind that lived permanently on the edge of catastrophe, one ill-judged word away from disaster. For Triboulet did not merely amuse the court, he needled it, mocked it, and skewered the vanity of the greatest nobles in France to their painted faces. And the nobles, who could crush a commoner without a second thought, had to sit and take it, because the little fool wore the king's protection like armour. But armour has gaps, and a jester who makes powerful enemies is a jester walking a very long way from any safe door. One famous story captures Triboulet's daring perfectly, and though we cannot prove every word, it has the ring of the man the records describe. A great nobleman, stung once too often by the fool's mockery, lost his temper and threatened, loudly, to have Triboulet beaten to death. Frightened for once in his life, Triboulet ran straight to King Francis himself and begged, breathless, for royal protection against the furious lord's terrible threat. The king, amused, tried to reassure him, promising that if the nobleman dared to kill him, he would have that nobleman executed just 15 minutes later. Now, most men would have found only cold comfort in a promise of vengeance to be enjoyed by no one but themselves, and only after their own death. But Triboulet, quick as ever, bowed low and replied, "Might it please your majesty, sire, to have the man executed some 15 minutes before instead?" It is a perfect jester's answer, turning the king's grand promise inside out to expose its uselessness, and doing it with a grin and a bow. Francis, we're told, laughed, and the story survives precisely because it shows the two things a great jester needed: courage and lightning speed. For a jester's wit was not decoration. It was his sword and his shield, the only weapon he had against a world that could crush him at will. A slow fool, a dull fool, a fool who fumbled his lines was not merely unfunny. He was defenceless, and defencelessness at court was often fatal. Triboulet survived and thrived on the sheer brilliance of his timing, on always having the perfect line ready the very instant it was needed. Historians still argue about how many of the tales told of him are true, and how many were polished or invented by later writers who loved a good story. Some of the sharpest anecdotes attach themselves to famous fools the way iron filings cling to a magnet, drawn by the shape of the legend rather than the facts. But the legend itself is the point, for it tells us what medieval and Renaissance people wanted a jester to be: fearless, quick, and gloriously unafraid of rank. In an age when almost everyone had to flatter and bow and swallow their true thoughts, the jester was a fantasy of freedom made flesh. He said what you could not. He mocked whom you dared not. He punctured the pride that oppressed you, and he did it most of the time and lived. No wonder people treasured their fools and told and retold their sharpest sayings, and forgave them almost anything for the sake of that intoxicating honesty. Under two very different kings, Triboulet learned to tailor his mischief, teasing careful Louis gently and daring far more with the bolder, prouder Francis. He grew rich in the king's favour, dressed in fine motley, fed at the royal table, and courted by the very nobles he delighted in mocking to their faces. But almost anything is not everything, and even Triboulet, the quickest tongue in France, would one day find the one line he could not take back. For there is always a limit, even for the licensed fool, a subject so sacred, a person so untouchable, that no joke, however brilliant, can survive crossing it. Triboulet knew where most of those lines lay, and danced along their edges for years with the confidence of a man who had never yet fallen. That confidence, that long unbroken run of triumphs, may have been exactly what set him up for the single catastrophic misstep that awaited him. Because the most dangerous moment for any daredevil is not his first performance, but his 100th, when fear has faded and he believes he cannot fall. And Triboulet, drunk on years of getting away with it, was about to attempt a prank so bold, so physically outrageous that it beggars belief. He was going to lay hands quite literally on the sacred person of the King of France himself, in front of the whole assembled court. It would be the funniest thing he ever did, and very nearly the last, a single reckless instant that turned a lifetime of favour into a death sentence. We will watch it unfold in a moment, the slap, the fury, the desperate scramble for a way out, and the extraordinary escape that followed. But hold the image of him for now, this small, fearless, brilliant man, beloved and protected, standing at the very peak of a king's affection. Picture him grinning by the throne, secure in his privilege, utterly certain that his wit could talk him out of anything, as it always had before. He's about to discover the outer edge of the fool's freedom, the precise point where a prank stops being funny and starts being treason. The court was in full glittering session, the hall bright with candles and jewels, King Francis I moving among his nobles in all his easy, dangerous majesty. Triboulet was there, of course, as he always was, weaving through the crowd, tossing out jibes, basking in the warmth of a king who adored him. And then, in one of those mad impulses that seize a man who has grown too comfortable, Triboulet saw his chance and could not resist it. The king had turned his back to speak with someone, presenting to the whole court and to his mischievous fool one gloriously tempting target. Before his better judgment could catch up with him, Triboulet darted forward and delivered a hearty, ringing slap to the royal backside. For one frozen instant, the entire court simply stopped, every conversation dying at once, every head turning, every single breath held in shared, horrified disbelief. To strike the king, to lay a hand on the sacred, anointed person of the monarch, was very close to the crime of treason itself. This was no jibe, no clever word that could be softened or explained. This was a physical assault upon the King of France, witnessed by dozens. King Francis spun around, and the easy good humour drained from his face, replaced by the cold, killing fury of a monarch publicly disrespected. In that moment, Tribolet's long, lucky run ended, and the little fool saw in the king's eyes the shadow of the executioner falling across him. But Francis, perhaps remembering all their long years of shared laughter, offered his trembling fool one strange, sporting chance to save his own neck. He would forgive the outrageous slap, the king declared, on one condition: that Tribolet could produce an apology even filthier and more insulting than the act itself. It was a cruel game, really, demanding that the terrified fool out-insult his own crime, and most men would have frozen or grovelled. But Tribolet was not most men, and even now, with his life on the line, the old lightning flickered one last fatal time. He bowed low, looked up at his furious king, and delivered the line that would echo through history: "Forgive me, sire, I did not recognise you." And then, before anyone in that silent hall could so much as breathe, he finished it: "I mistook you, your majesty, for the queen." It was, purely as a joke, perfect. A flawless piece of insolence that turned the apology itself into a far worse insult, exactly as demanded. But it broke the one rule Tribolet should never have broken, for it dragged the queen, the king's own wife, into the filth of the jest. The queen was the one person at that court entirely beyond mockery, sacred and untouchable, and to insult her was worse, far worse, than any slap. Francis, who had asked for a worse insult, now got one so perfectly aimed that it left him no room to laugh it away. His fury redoubled, and the king who had offered mercy snatched it back, and ordered that Tribolet be put to death for his intolerable insolence. And so the fool's own brilliance had condemned him, his greatest joke and his death warrant signed in the very same breath. Yet the king, even in his anger, could not quite forget the years of loyal laughter, and he granted his doomed fool one final mercy. Tribolet would be allowed to choose the manner of his own death, to name the way he wished to die, whatever way seemed least dreadful to him. It was meant as a grim kindness, a small dignity offered to a condemned man, and no one expected it to become the fool's final escape. For Tribolet, facing death, reached one last time into his bottomless bag of wit, and pulled out the cleverest answer of his entire life. "Good sire," he said, "I choose to die of old age, and may that death be a very long time in coming." The whole court held its breath, and then, against every expectation, King Francis burst out laughing, disarmed utterly by the sheer audacity of it. He could not, having granted the choice, deny it. The fool had chosen a death that could not be delivered, and had trapped his king in his own mercy. So Francis commuted the sentence entirely, sparing Tribolet's life, and instead merely banished him for good from the court and the whole kingdom of France. Banishment was a heavy blow for a man whose whole world was the court, but it was undeniably a great deal better than the axe. And so Tribolet talked his way off the executioner's block with the same weapon that had put him there: his impossible, irrepressible wit. We do not truly know where Tribolet went, or how his exile ended, for the records that loved his jokes cared far less about his quieter final years. But the lesson of his story rings clear enough. Even the most protected fool holds his freedom on loan, and the lender may call it in at any moment. Historians still argue over how much of this famous scene is literal truth, and how much is legend, burnished bright by centuries of retelling. But whether it happened exactly so or not, the story was too good to lose, and it made Tribolet immortal long after his bells fell silent. Centuries later, the French writer Victor Hugo took the figure of the court jester, and built around him a great tragic play about a fool and a careless king. That play, in turn, became the basis for one of the most beloved operas ever written, Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletto, still performed around the world today. So the little hunchbacked fool who slapped a king and joked his way off the scaffold sings on, in a sense, in opera houses 8 centuries later. Not every jester, though, had Tribolet's luck or his lightning tongue, and for others the same reckless courage ended not in banishment but in blood. If Tribolet shows us the jester at his most reckless, our next fool shows us something gentler, the rare, precious bond that could grow between a king and his fool. Cross the sea now from France to England and step forward in time to the roaring, terrifying court of King Henry VIII. Henry is remembered as a giant of a king, magnificent and monstrous by turns, a man whose displeasure could send wives and ministers alike to the block. To serve such a king was to live in the shadow of sudden death, for his moods were weather, and his weather could turn deadly in an instant. And yet, into this dangerous court came a man who could call the great King Henry by his first name, tease him, scold him, and somehow always survive. His name was Will Somers, and he was Henry's fool for many years, and by every account the king loved him as he loved almost no one else. Where Tribolet's wit was a rapier, Will's was something warmer, a gentle, shrewd, affectionate humour that could reach the king when nothing else could. Will Somers could say things to Henry that would have cost a duke his head, and Henry, astonishingly, took it from him, and laughed, and asked for more. He called the king simply Harry, a familiarity so shocking that its mere survival tells you how deep the affection between the two men ran. He teased Henry about his spending, mocked his swelling waistline, and made sharp little jokes about the courtiers who fawned and schemed around the throne. When Henry grew old, sick, and monstrously heavy, his leg rotting with an ulcer that never healed, few dared come near his black moods. But Will Somers could still make the suffering king laugh, and in those grim final years that gift was worth more than all the physicians in England. There is a real sweetness in the picture. The terrifying old tyrant racked with pain, soothed and gentled by the only man unafraid to joke with him. Historians who have sifted the records find, it is true, surprisingly little hard fact about Will, just scattered mentions, account book payments, and well-worn anecdotes. We see him in the royal accounts, clothed and kept at the king's expense, and we glimpse him in a famous portrait of Henry's family standing quietly at the edge. But the sheer warmth of the legend, the insistence across the centuries that Henry truly loved this man, is itself a kind of evidence worth weighing. One anecdote told long after his death has Will describing a rough moment with his royal master in gloriously comic, tumbling, wildly improbable exaggeration. Henry, the story goes, once cuffed him for a joke that stung too sharply, and Will complained that the blow sent him flying clean through 3 chambers, down 4 flights of stairs, he said, over 5 barrels and all the way to the very bottom of the cellar, a wonderful piece of comic hyperbole. Whether the cuff was real or invented, the joke tells the truth of the relationship. Rough, physical, affectionate, and utterly without the usual terror. For most people, a blow from Henry VIII was a catastrophe. For Will Somers, it was merely material, one more thing to spin into a laugh. That is the mark of the truly great fool, the ability to take even danger and disappointment and fear and alchemize them into something that heals. Will did not use his privilege to wound, as Tribolet often did, but to comfort, to lighten, to carry a little warmth into the coldest corners of power. Historians still argue about how much real influence he had, but there is a persistent tradition that will sometimes nudge the king toward mercy and generosity. A well-placed joke at the right moment could soften a royal decision, could remind a raging king of the human cost of his anger. If even a fraction of that is true, then Will Somers did more good with his bells than many a solemn counsellor did with his seals and speeches. He seems to have died around the time of the young King Edward, having served in one way or another into the next reign. A rare and lucky old age for a fool, and unlike so many who surrounded Henry, Will Somers kept both his position and his head, dying peacefully in a bed rather than screaming on a scaffold. That, in the court of Henry VIII, was no small achievement, and it speaks volumes about the man's judgment as well as his wit. For behind the clowning, the great fools were shrewd readers of people, students of mood and power who happened to deliver their insights as jokes. Will Somers survived a court that devoured the mighty precisely because he understood, better than the mighty did, exactly where the dangerous lines lay. He teased, but he never truly humiliated. He mocked, but he never made the king feel small. He told the truth, but always wrapped in warmth. It is a masterclass, really, in how to speak honestly to power without being destroyed by it, and it is as relevant now as it was then. So we have seen the two faces of the jester. Tribolet, who danced too close to the fire, and Will, who warmed himself at it for a lifetime. Both had the same license, the same dangerous freedom, but they spent it very differently, and their different fates followed from that difference. The lesson, if a bedtime story is allowed a lesson, is that the how of a joke matters as much as the what, and that kindness is its own kind of cleverness. But not all of the great medieval pranksters worked inside the safety of a court, sheltered under the protection of a powerful king who loved them. Some wandered the wide world alone, armed with nothing but their wits, playing tricks on strangers, and our next tale belongs to the most famous of them all. Leave the palaces behind now, and the safety of a king's protection, and come with me out onto the open roads of medieval Germany. Here we meet a very different kind of prankster. Not a court fool cushioned by royal favour, but a wandering rogue who answered to no one at all. His name was Till Eulenspiegel, and for 500 years his tricks have been told and retold across Germany and far beyond. According to the legend, Till was born around the year 1300 in the village of Kneitlingen, in the German Duchy of Brunswick. He is said to have died around 1350 in the town of Mölln, where a gravestone bearing his name has been shown to travellers for centuries. Whether a real Till ever lived is one of those questions historians love to argue over, and the honest answer is that we simply cannot be sure. He may have been a genuine 14th century vagabond whose exploits grew in the telling, or he may be pure folklore, a face invented to hang 1,000 jokes upon. What is certain is that his tales were gathered and printed in a little book in the early 1500s in the German city of Strasbourg. That book became a runaway success, one of the first great bestsellers of the age of printing, and it carried Till's mischief across all of Europe. His very name is a riddle and a clue, for Eulenspiegel means quite literally owl and mirror, two images stitched together into one strange emblem. The owl was a bird of wisdom but also of ill omen, and the mirror was a thing that shows you, whether you like it or not, exactly what you are. Together, owl and mirror, they hint at what Till really was, a holder-up of mirrors, forcing the proud and the foolish to see their own reflections. For Till's tricks were not random cruelty. They were aimed, again and again, at the greedy, the pompous, the dishonest, and the self-important. He made fools of grasping innkeepers, cheating tradesmen, arrogant nobles, pretentious scholars, and above all the quack physicians who preyed on the desperate and the sick. And his signature weapon was a strange and maddening one. He took people absolutely, ruinously, literally doing exactly what he was told and nothing more. Tell Till to do a job in a particular way, phrase your instruction carelessly, and he would follow your words to the letter while utterly destroying your meaning. Ask him to sift the flour, and finding no sieve to hand, he might sift it out in the moonlit yard, leaving it strewn across the ground. Employed by a tailor and told to sew the garment so no one would ever see the stitching, he sewed in the dark with no candle, ruining the lot. Told by a baker to bake owls and long-tailed monkeys as a sarcastic dismissal, he cheerfully did exactly that, and then sold the odd little loaves at a profit. Each trick was a small, stinging lesson in the gap between what people say and what people mean, delivered with a perfectly straight and innocent face. There is a deep cleverness hidden in this literal mindedness, a way of exposing the sloppiness, the pretension, and the hidden contempt buried in everyday speech. When a master speaks carelessly to a servant, he reveals that he does not really see the servant as a thinking person at all, merely a tool. Till's relentless literal obedience turned that very carelessness back on the master, punishing the quiet arrogance folded invisibly into 100 casual commands. Historians still argue about what the Till tales really meant to the people who first devoured them, hungry for laughter in a hard and hierarchical world. For the readers were mostly ordinary folk, and Till was one of their own, a low-born nobody who again and again bested his supposed betters. Every trick in which a clever peasant humiliated a rich merchant or a proud lord was a small, delicious revenge for a whole class of powerless people. It is surely no accident that Till's tales flowered in the years after the Black Death, when the old order had been shaken to its very foundations. A plague that killed perhaps a third of Europe had thinned the ranks of masters and lords, and made the surviving common folk suddenly, dangerously aware of their own worth. Into that changed world stepped Till, or the idea of Till, a figure who refused to be cowed, who laughed at his betters, and walked away whistling. But we should not romanticize him too far, for Till could be genuinely cruel, and many of his tricks left real victims smarting, poorer or humiliated. Some of his jokes were frankly disgusting, involving filth and bodily functions in ways that delighted medieval readers and would clear a modern room. He was no gentle Will Sommers, warming a king's heart. He was a wild card, a disruptor, a man who left a trail of chaos wherever he wandered. And that, perhaps, was exactly the point. For a trickster is not a hero, but a force of nature, a reminder that the tidy world can always be upended. Every settled town Till entered, he left a little less sure of itself, its pomposities punctured, its hypocrisies exposed, its dignity gently vandalized. Then he would shoulder his pack and walk on to the next town, the next mark, the next carefully literal catastrophe, forever moving, forever free. In that endless wandering there is something both thrilling and lonely, the freedom of a man who belongs nowhere and answers to no one on earth. Till Eulenspiegel never won a manor like Roland, nor a king's love like Will, but he won something else, a kind of immortality as the eternal trickster, and the tales of that trickster carry us naturally toward another great home of the medieval prank. Not the road or the court, but the pages of the storyteller. Not every medieval prank was played on a real person. Some of the most beloved were played on imaginary ones, Inside the tales people told for pure delight, for alongside their pious legends of saints, medieval audiences adored a very different kind of story. Bawdy, clever, and absolutely riddled with pranks. In France, these comic tales were called fabliaux, short, sharp, funny stories in verse, written and performed between roughly the 12th and 14th centuries. They were the opposite of everything solemn. Earthy, irreverent, obsessed with money, food, and above all the delicious mechanics of a really good trick. The characters were ordinary people, tradesmen and peasants, priests and students, cunning wives and gullible husbands, drawn from the everyday world the audience knew, and the plots ran on trickery, on elaborate schemes and counter-schemes, on clever people fooling stupid ones and getting away with it. Or almost. There was even a rough code of justice in these tales, which scholars call fabliaux justice, where the greedy, the cruel, and the foolish got precisely what they deserved. It was not the justice of the church or the courts, but the justice of the joke, in which the sharpest wit, not the purest soul, came out on top. The single most famous descendant of this tradition is English, and comes from the pen of Geoffrey Chaucer in his immortal Canterbury Tales. Among those pilgrims riding to Canterbury is a drunken miller, and the story he tells is a fabliau of such perfect, filthy craftsmanship that it still delights readers today. The Miller's Tale is, at its heart, a story about pranks, a whole clockwork of interlocking tricks that build to one of literature's great comic explosions. It concerns a foolish old carpenter, his lovely young wife, and two rival young men, both desperate to win her affection out from under him. The first, a clever scholar named Nicholas, lodges in the carpenter's house and hatches an outrageous scheme to get the old man out of the way. He convinces the gullible carpenter with much solemn play acting that a second great flood, like Noah's, is coming to drown the whole world. The only escape, Nicholas insists, is to hang 3 great tubs from the rafters, one each, in which they will float away when the waters rise. So the poor carpenter, terrified, hangs the tubs and climbs into his, waiting to be saved, while the 2 young lovers slip away below to enjoy the night. It is a prank built on faith and fear, a con man using another man's piety and terror against him, and the audience roared at the cleverness of it. But the tale is not done, for there is a second suitor, a squeamish, fastidious parish clerk named Absalon, who also loves the carpenter's wife. Absalon comes serenading beneath her window in the dark, begging for a single kiss, and the wife, to be rid of him, decides to play a trick of her own. What exactly she offered him to kiss in the pitch darkness is not quite the sort of thing a bedtime story dwells upon in detail. Suffice to say, the kiss was not on the lips. The joke was thoroughly on Absalon, and the audience of Chaucer's day found it absolutely uproarious. Humiliated and furious, Absalon plots his revenge, borrowing a red-hot iron blade from the village blacksmith to repay the insult in kind. He returns, begs another kiss, and this time it is the scholar Nicholas who leans out to mock him in the dark and receives the burning iron. His howl of pain is what finally undoes everyone, for he screams for water, and the terrified carpenter, hearing the word, thinks the flood has come at last. The old man cuts the rope of his hanging tub and crashes to the floor, breaking his arm, waking the whole street to his ruin and his shame. It is a genuine masterpiece of comic engineering, 4 entirely separate pranks colliding together in a single instant of glorious, painful, perfectly timed chaos, and every character is punished exactly in proportion to their folly. The jealous old fool, the vain clerk, the over-clever scholar all get their comeuppance. Only the wife walks away untouched, which tells you something about the cheerful, amoral spirit of the fabliau and the audience that loved it. Chaucer knew exactly what he was doing, framing the whole filthy romp as a mere tale told by a drunkard, so he could disown its rudeness with a wink. Historians still argue about how these tales relate to real life, whether they reflect how medieval people actually behaved, or merely how they loved to imagine misbehaving. Probably it is the second. For fantasy pranks in a story are safe in a way real pranks never are. No one truly gets a broken arm from a poem, but the tales still tell us what medieval audiences found funny, and the answer is startling. Almost exactly the same things we find funny today. Cleverness rewarded, pomposity punctured, the mighty brought low, the trickster triumphant, the human body in all its embarrassing glory. It is a comedy we still recognise. There is something deeply reassuring in that, in reaching back 700 years and finding people laughing helplessly at a well-built dirty joke. It collapses the distance between us and them, reminding us that beneath the strange clothes and stranger beliefs beat hearts that loved a good laugh as much as ours. The fabliaux are, in a sense, the prank preserved in amber, The medieval sense of humour caught alive on the page for us to enjoy centuries later, and they remind us that the line we have traced all night, between the harmless joke and the harmful one, runs through fiction as surely as through life. In the story, the burning iron and the broken arm are funny. In reality, they would be a maiming and a crippling, and everyone knew the difference. But some medieval pranks did cross from story into reality, and left real bodies broken, and to those darker tales we must now reluctantly turn. We return now to the students, those clever, restless, dangerous young men we met earlier parading with dung on their faces, and we follow them somewhere much darker. The medieval universities were unlike anything before them. Great gatherings of young men, sometimes only boys, drawn from across Europe to study in a handful of crowded towns. They were clergy, technically tonsured and set apart, which gave them special legal privileges and shielded them from much of the ordinary town's authority. That special status was a constant source of friction, for a student who broke the law often escaped the town's courts, answering only to the more lenient church. Add to that the ordinary strains of youth, homesickness, poverty and drink, and you had a tinderbox of frustrated young men packed into narrow medieval streets. Imagine then the fury of ordinary townsfolk watching privileged young outsiders drink, brawl and misbehave, and then slip free of any real punishment. Out of this restless student world came a strange and brilliant subculture, the Goliards, wandering scholar poets who turned misrule into an art form. The Goliards wrote in Latin, the language of the church, but they used it to sing the praises of wine, gambling, love, and glorious unrepentant idleness. They composed drinking songs and satires so sharp they mocked the Pope himself. Poems collected centuries later in the famous manuscript we call the Carmina Burana. In their verses, the whole solemn order of the medieval world is turned upside down, with taverns as churches and dice as devotions, all in flawless scholarly Latin. It was misrule for the educated, a prank played on the church in its own sacred tongue, mocking authority with the very tools authority had given them. But student misrule was not always so witty, and often it was not witty at all, spilling instead into drunkenness, vandalism and violence. And the deepest fault line ran between the students, the gown, and the ordinary citizens of the town, a rivalry that simmered constantly and sometimes boiled over. Nowhere did it boil over more catastrophically than in Oxford. On the 10th of February in the year 1355, on the feast of St. Scholastica, it began, as so many disasters do, with something small. A few students drinking in a tavern called the Swindlestock, in the heart of the town. The students complained about the quality of the wine they had been served, and words were exchanged with the taverner, sharp words, then insults. In the version that comes down to us, the angry scholars flung the wine, and then the very tankard, into the taverner's face, and the brawl was on. What might have stayed a simple tavern scuffle instead detonated, because in a university town an insult to one student was an insult to them all. The town bell of St. Martin's was rung to summon the townsfolk, and the university bell answered, and suddenly two armed mobs faced each other in the streets. What followed was not a prank or a brawl, but something close to a small war, fought over 2, perhaps 3, days across the whole of Oxford. Townsmen poured in from the surrounding countryside to join the fight, and the students, outnumbered, were hunted through the lanes and colleges. Halls of residence were stormed and looted, scholars were dragged out and killed, and the chronicles speak of real atrocities committed in the heat of it. By the time the violence finally burned itself out, dozens lay dead, perhaps 60 students and townsfolk together, slaughtered over a complaint about wine. It is a staggering, sobering figure, a reminder of how thin the ice was, how quickly the medieval world could slide from insult to atrocity. And the aftermath was extraordinary, for the crown and the church came down entirely on the side of the university and against the town. The town of Oxford was punished with a penance so humiliating it lasted for centuries. An annual ritual of submission to the university it had fought. Every year on the anniversary, the mayor and leading citizens were required to attend a special service and pay a fine, 1 penny for each scholar slain. This yearly humiliation continued, quite astonishingly, for almost 500 long years, and was not finally abolished until deep into the 19th century. Think of that! A single bad-tempered argument over a jug of wine echoing down half a millennium of enforced annual civic shame. The St. Scholastica Day riot is not strictly a prank gone wrong, but it grew from the same soil, the same reckless, mocking us-against-them student spirit. It shows the terrifying far end of the road that begins with a jeering song and a shoved shoulder, the point where misrule becomes massacre. Historians still argue over the exact death toll and the precise sequence of events, as they always must with a chaos so old and so poorly recorded. But the essential story is beyond doubt. and its lesson is written in blood. A culture of casual mockery is a culture always one insult from disaster. The students who smeared dung on their faces and jeered at their betters were, most of the time, only having fun, and no one was truly hurt. But the same spirit, the same contempt for the ordinary townsfolk, the same certainty of their own superiority, is what turned a wine jug into a weapon. This is the shadow that falls across all our merry tales tonight, the knowledge that the license to mock and the license to harm are neighbours, sharing a wall. Most of the time that wall holds, and the mockery stays mockery, and everyone laughs and goes home, but the wall is thinner than anyone likes to think, and nowhere was that thin wall more dangerous than in a custom we have not yet properly met, a village prank designed, from the start, to wound. For not all pranks were meant in fun. Some were weapons of shame, aimed by a whole community at a chosen victim, and to those we turn next. Come with me now out of the university towns and into the villages, into the small, close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. In a medieval village, privacy as we understand it barely existed, and the community felt it had every right to judge and punish its members' private lives. And its favourite instrument of punishment was a strange, half-festive, half-menacing custom that historians usually call, by its old French name, the charivari. In England it went by other names, rough music, or the skimmington, or in the north the stang ride, but the spirit of it was everywhere the same. Picture a household that had, in the eyes of the village, broken the unwritten rules of proper behaviour, and so earned the community's stern disapproval. Perhaps a man had let his wife beat him, or a widow had married a boy half her age, or an old man had taken a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. Perhaps a husband was known to stray, or a wife to nag, or a couple to quarrel so loudly that the whole street knew their business. Whatever the offence against custom, the village had a way of letting the offenders know exactly how it felt, and it was not subtle. As night fell, the neighbours would gather outside the offending house, and they would begin, quite deliberately, to make the most hideous noise imaginable. This was the rough music that gave the custom its English name, though there was nothing musical about it at all, quite the opposite. They banged pots and pans, they rattled kettles, they blew horns, they beat on cauldrons and fire irons, and anything else that would make a dreadful din. They shouted, they jeered, they sang filthy, mocking songs about the couple inside, cataloguing their failings for the whole village to enjoy. It was a symphony of contempt, a wall of jeering noise deliberately designed to shame, to humiliate, and to make the victims feel the full weight of communal judgment. And it often came with a piece of grim theatre, a mocking procession that acted out the offence for all to see. In the Skimmington ride, a couple of villagers would dress up to represent the shamed pair, often with the roles pointedly and insultingly reversed. A man might dress as the henpecked husband, seated backwards on a horse, holding a distaff to show he did women's work, while another played the domineering wife. The very word skimmington may come from the skimming ladle, a kitchen tool the mock wife would brandish to beat her mock husband about the head. In the northern stang ride, the victim, or someone standing in for him, was hoisted onto a stout pole, the stang, and carried through the streets on the shoulders of the crowd. Jolted and jeered at, paraded past every neighbour's door, the target was made a public spectacle, a living lesson in what the village would not tolerate. Sometimes the real offenders were seized and forced to endure it themselves. Sometimes only effigies, straw figures stood in for them, later burned or dumped in a pond. Historians still argue about how to understand all this, whether it was rough community justice, cruel mob bullying, or a genuine ritual that helped hold villages together. In its gentler forms, it could look almost like a wedding custom, a boisterous but affectionate teasing of newlyweds, all noise and laughter and good cheer. So the same rough custom could be a warm welcome for a beloved new couple, or a cold weapon against a hated one, depending entirely on the village's mood. Indeed, some of these traditions survive today, softened into the harmless racket of tin cans tied to a wedding carriage, a distant, friendly echo of the old rough music. But in its harsher forms, the charivari was something far darker, a weapon of conformity, a way for a community to terrorise anyone who stepped out of line. It enforced the village's rules about marriage, about gender, about age, about behaviour, punishing difference with a savagery dressed up as festive fun. And this is the crucial, uncomfortable point. The charivari was a prank in form but a punishment in function, and the two were deliberately, cleverly blended. By wrapping cruelty in the costume of carnival, the village could inflict real harm while pretending it was all just a bit of harmless traditional fun. The masks and the music and the mockery gave everyone cover. No single person was responsible, for it was simply the custom, simply the village having its say. That is what makes the charivari so revealing, and so unsettling, for it shows how easily the machinery of the prank can be turned to the work of the mob. A joke that everyone joins in on, aimed at a single isolated victim, is only a hair's breadth from persecution, however much laughter surrounds it. We recognise the shape of it still, in the way a crowd can turn on a chosen target, in the cruelty that hides comfortably inside collective mockery. The medieval villagers would have been puzzled by our unease, for to them the charivari was justice, the community defending its values against those who flouted them. And perhaps, in a world with no police and few courts, such rough communal pressure was the only law that reached into the private lives of ordinary people. But it is hard, listening across the centuries to that wall of jeering noise, not to feel for the frightened souls huddled inside the shuttered house. Historians still debate whether the charivari did more to hold communities together or to tear vulnerable people apart, and the honest answer is surely some of both. It was the pranker's social control, laughter weaponized, mockery given the force of law, and it could all too easily tip over into real violence. For a crowd worked up into a jeering frenzy outside a man's door is a crowd that does not always stop at noise. However, it began the evening. And what happened when the rough music turned from shaming into bloodshed is the darker tale we must follow next, into the night. The charivari lived always on a knife's edge, for a crowd summoned to shame a neighbour is a crowd already halfway to something worse. Most nights the rough music stayed just that, a night of jeering noise, and by morning the village had made its point and life went grudgingly on. But not every night ended so tamely, for a crowd is a fickle and dangerous animal, and the same energy that made a joke could just as easily make a mob. Once a community had gathered in the dark, masked and anonymous, drunk on noise and righteous anger, the line between shaming and violence grew perilously thin. A shuttered door might be broken down, a victim dragged out into the street, a mocking ride turned into a real and brutal beating. Effigies meant to be burned in jest sometimes became the rehearsal for burning the real thing, the pretend violence sliding into the actual. And because the whole point of the mask was that no one could be blamed, there was little to hold the crowd back once its blood was up. Historians have traced cases where a charivari, begun as rough communal justice, ended in serious injury, in wrecked homes and sometimes in death. The victims were often the most vulnerable, the outsider, the newcomer, the widow, the couple whose only crime was to love in a way the village disliked. And the same masked, festive cover that made carnivals so joyous made it, in the wrong moment, the perfect disguise for settling a grudge with a knife. We saw this already in the great carnivals, where a mocking song could become a shove a brawl, and a brawl a riot. Under the cover of the crowd and the mask, old enemies could strike at each other, and no witness could ever quite say who had thrown the fatal blow. The authorities knew this perfectly well, and it terrified them. For a masked and disguised crowd was a crowd beyond the reach of the law. In Venice, famous for its carnival masks, the laws grew especially strict, limiting when and where the beautiful disguises could be worn at all. This is why, again and again across medieval and early modern Europe, we find laws passed against the wearing of masks and disguises in public. Town councils forbade citizens from going about with covered faces, especially at night, precisely because a hidden face was a license for mischief and worse. A man who could not be recognised could not be held accountable, and so the mask, that symbol of festive freedom, became also a symbol of fear. The very anonymity that let the shy reveller dance freely without embarrassment also let the murderer approach his chosen victim without any warning at all. And so the merry mask and the menacing mask were, in the end, the very same object, its meaning changing entirely with the intent behind it. Historians still argue about how common the truly violent charivari really was, or whether the few surviving records simply exaggerate a handful of rare disasters. As always, the quiet nights that ended in nothing but a headache left no trace, while the nights that ended in blood filled the court rolls. But the fear was real, and the laws were real, and the repeated bans tell us that the authorities genuinely dreaded what a masked crowd might do. There is a deeper pattern here that runs through everything we've explored tonight, from the Feast of Fools to the village rough music. Every one of these customs worked by granting a temporary license, a suspension of the normal rules, a permission to behave as one normally could not, and every one of them carried the same hidden danger, that a license to break the rules is also always a license that can be terribly abused. The genius of the medieval world was to try to contain that danger with ritual, to fence the wildness inside a season, a costume, a custom. The tragedy was that the fence did not always hold, and when it broke, the same energy that fueled the fun fueled the violence. A society that gives itself permission to mock must somehow also find a way to stop the mockery before it becomes murder. and that is genuinely hard. The medievals tried, with their bans and their rules and their appointed lords of misrule, to keep one hand on the reins of the chaos they unleashed. Sometimes they succeeded, and the season passed in nothing but laughter. Sometimes they failed, and the laughter curdled into something no one had wanted. It is easy, from the comfort of our own age, to feel superior, to imagine we would never let a joke curdle into cruelty or a crowd into a mob. But the same machinery is still with us. The crowd, the mask, the shared mockery, the intoxicating sense that the normal rules do not apply tonight. The medieval charivari has never really died. It has only changed its costume, and its music now plays on other stages with other tools. Historians still argue about all of it, but the deepest lesson may be the simplest, that laughter is a fire warming when contained, devouring when it escapes. And the medieval world, more than ours, lived close to that fire, warming itself gladly at a blaze it never entirely trusted or controlled. So we leave the village now, its rough music fading behind us, its lesson lodged uncomfortably in the mind as we walk on into the dark. For the mask has led us somewhere sinister, and there is one more, worse thing that the disguise of festive fun could hide. Not just a beating, not just a grudge settled in the dark, but treason, conspiracy, and the plotted murder of a king. And so we come now to the most dangerous prank costume in all of medieval history, the innocent disguise of the Christmas mummer. Mumming was one of the most beloved and most ancient of all the midwinter customs, a game of disguise that turned neighbours into mysterious strangers. At its heart, mumming was simple. People would dress up, hide their faces, and go from house to house through the dark winter evenings, uninvited. The word itself may come from an old root meaning to be silent, and indeed the classic mummer often kept a strict, eerie silence throughout. They would knock at a door, and when it opened, push their way inside, a crowd of masked and costumed figures saying nothing, faces hidden. Once inside, the mummers would dance or dice or perform some little play, and the householder was expected to guess who these silent visitors really were. If he guessed correctly or simply played along, he would offer them food and drink, and the mummers would move on to the next house. It sounds charming, and often it was. A warm bit of midwinter mischief that broke the long boredom of the dark season with mystery and laughter. Children especially loved the mummers, half thrilled and half terrified by the silent masked figures who appeared, as if by magic, out of the winter dark. And the costumes could be wonderfully strange, figures sewn all over with ribbons, or hidden inside straw, or crowned with the antlers and hides of beasts. But pause for a moment on what mumming actually involved. A group of disguised strangers, faces hidden, forcing their way uninvited into your home after dark. Put that way, it sounds less like a game and rather more like a home invasion, and that unsettling double nature was always part of it. For the same custom that brought merry neighbours to your door could just as easily bring robbers, or worse, hiding behind the very same masks. A gang of thieves had only to don the costumes of mummers to walk, unchallenged and unrecognised, straight into the houses of the wealthy. Once inside, under cover of the game, they could rob the household or intimidate it, or settle some private score and slip away into the night unknown. This is why mumming, like the carnival mask, drew the repeated suspicion of the authorities, who saw in it a standing invitation to crime. In particular, the custom of mumming with dice, of entering a house and gambling with the host, was singled out for special disapproval and repeated bans. For an invited game of dice was one thing, but masked strangers arriving to gamble was a recipe for cheating, quarrels, and violence. Laws were passed forbidding mumming in various towns and at various times, forbidding the wearing of visors, forbidding the carrying of concealed weapons in disguise. The rulers of medieval England grew especially nervous about the custom of mumming, and with very good reason indeed, as we are just about to see. For the disguise of the innocent mummer, that silent, masked, house-invading reveller, turned out to be the perfect cover for the deadliest game of all. Historians still argue about the exact origins of mumming, and about how its various forms, the silent visit, the little play, the sword dance, all fit together. Some trace it to ancient midwinter rites, others to medieval guild performances, and the truth is probably a tangled braid of many roots grown together. What is clear is that mumming was widespread, deep-rooted and beloved, surviving in various forms right down into modern times in some corners of Britain. The traditional mummers' play, still performed in a few villages today, preserves a strange, dreamlike fragment of this ancient world of disguise. In it, a hero is slain and then magically revived by a comic doctor, a little drama of death and resurrection acted out in the dead of winter. It is a gentle survival now, a quaint piece of folklore, but it carries within it the memory of a custom that was once genuinely double-edged. For every warm night of harmless mumming, there was the shadow of the other kind, the disguise that hid not a neighbour but a threat. And the greatest of those threats was aimed not at a household or a purse, but at the very throne of England itself. Because if masked men could walk uninvited into any house, then masked men could walk, in theory, into a royal hall, into the presence of a king. And a king surrounded by masked, costumed, unrecognised strangers in the relaxed and drunken atmosphere of a Christmas revel was a king in terrible danger. The very things that made the mumming fun, the disguise, the surprise, the suspension of the usual suspicion, were the things that made it perfect for murder. This was not a theoretical fear, for at least twice in English history plotters tried to use exactly this cover to strike at their king. The mummer's costume, the innocent festive disguise, became the chosen instrument of treason, of conspiracy, of the plotted assassination of a monarch. It is the ultimate chilling example of our theme tonight, the prank-turned weapon, the merry festive mask hiding the cold assassin's face. And so we must leave the warm and mostly harmless mumming of the ordinary village and climb toward the deadly intrigues of the royal court. We must follow the masked conspirators up the very steps of power and watch the merriest disguise of the year turn to the darkest of purposes. Picture, then, a great castle at Christmas, its hall bright and warm, its king at ease among the revels, his guard relaxed for the holy season. And picture, gathering in the cold outside, a band of men in the costumes of mummers, their faces masked, their intentions anything but festive. Beneath the motley and the visors they carry not dice and songs, but hidden blades and a plan to murder a king and topple a throne. This is the Epiphany Rising, one of the darkest pranks that never quite was, and it is where our journey turns next. It is the very end of the year 1399, and England has a brand new king upon its throne, and a very nervous one at that. Henry Bolingbroke has just seized the throne, becoming King Henry IV, by deposing his own cousin, the anointed King Richard II. He had a crown, but he didn't yet have safety, for a man who takes a throne by force must always wonder who might try to take it back from him. Richard, once the undisputed King of England, now sits a prisoner in a northern castle, alive but powerless, a living reproach to the man who took his crown. And around the new king simmers a dangerous resentment, for not everyone accepts that a rightful, anointed monarch can simply be pushed aside. A group of great noblemen, earls and barons who had prospered under Richard, begin to plot in secret to undo what Bolingbroke has done. Their aim is nothing less than to kill the new king, Henry IV, along with his sons, and to restore the deposed Richard to his throne. But how does one get close enough to a wary, newly crowned king surrounded by guards to strike him down? The conspirators found their answer in the season. It was Christmas, the great season of revels, and Henry was to keep the feast at Windsor Castle, with tournaments and celebrations planned for the 12 days. And the 12 days of Christmas, as we know so well by now, were the season of mumming, of masks and disguises and unannounced festive visitors. According to the tradition that has come down to us, the plotters meant to use exactly this cover to get their armed men close to the king. Under the guise of a mumming, a Christmas disguising, or a grand tournament, the conspirators and their followers would gather at Windsor with their weapons hidden. In the relaxed, festive chaos of the season, masked and costumed, they could approach the king in his own hall and cut him down before any guard could react. It was the mummer's game turned deadly, the innocent midwinter disguise chosen as the perfect cover for regicide, for the murder of an anointed king. The plot was set for the Feast of the Epiphany, the 6th of January, the culmination of the Christmas season, and so it is called the Epiphany Rising. Everything was in place. The men, the weapons, the disguises, the timing, the deposed king waiting in the wings to be restored to his throne. And then, as so often happens with grand conspiracies, at the last moment something went wrong, and the whole deadly plan unravelled. The tradition holds that one of the conspirators lost his nerve, or his loyalty, and betrayed the plot to the king before it could be sprung. In one famous version, a plotter confessed everything to his own father, who was horrified, and who rushed to warn King Henry of the danger closing around him. Forewarned, Henry did not wait to be murdered in his hall. He slipped away from Windsor in the night and fled to the safety of London. When the conspirators arrived to find their prey gone and their plot exposed, their scheme collapsed instantly into panic and desperate flight. What had been planned as a swift, masked assassination became instead a shambolic, doomed rebellion, with the plotters scattering across the country. The people, by and large, did not rise for them, and the great lords found themselves hunted fugitives rather than triumphant kingmakers. The end was brutal, as the end of failed treason always was, and it came swiftly upon the ringleaders one by one. Several of the chief conspirators were caught by angry townsfolk at Cirencester, and without waiting for any royal trial, the mob simply beheaded them in the street. Others were captured and executed in the grim, ceremonial fashion reserved for traitors, and the heads of the plotters were soon displayed above the gates of London. And the deposed King Richard, in whose name the whole plot had been launched, did not long survive the failure of his would-be rescuers. Within weeks he was dead in his northern prison, almost certainly murdered, most likely starved, to remove him as a rallying point for any future rising. So the Epiphany Rising ended in total catastrophe for everyone involved. The plotters dead, their cause destroyed, and the very king they hoped to save killed. Historians still argue over the details, over how much the mumming disguise really featured in the plan, and how much was added by later chroniclers. But the essential shape is solid history. A real plot, at a real Christmas, to use the cover of festive revels to murder a King of England. And it was not the only one, for a few years later, in the reign of Henry IV's son, another plotter reached for the very same disguise. Sir John Oldcastle, a religious rebel, was said to have planned to smuggle armed men, disguised as mummers, into the king's presence at a Christmas feast. That plan too was betrayed and foiled, but the very repetition tells us how real and how frightening this festive threat had become. Twice, the merriest disguise of the medieval year, the innocent costume of the Christmas mummer, was chosen as the mask behind which to murder a monarch. It is the darkest possible version of our theme, the prank as pure weapon, the festive game emptied of all fun and filled instead with treason and blood. And it explains, better than any decree, why the authorities feared the mask so much, and passed law after law against the wearing of disguises. For they knew, from bitter experience, that behind the laughing visor of the mummer might lurk not a merry neighbour, but the cold face of an assassin. So let us step back now, gratefully, from the edge of that particular abyss, and return to lighter, kinder pranks, as our long night begins its gentle turn toward rest. Let us turn now to a prank you already know, one you may even have played yourself, for it is the last great survivor of the medieval spirit of misrule. Every year, on the 1st of April across much of the world, people play tricks on one another, tell absurd lies and cry when the victim falls for it, April Fool. It is the one day in our modern calendar when a little licensed mischief is still, by ancient custom, allowed and even expected. And its origins, fittingly enough for a day devoted to confusion, are genuinely, gloriously confused, a knotty mystery that historians have never fully solved. No one knows for certain where April Fool's Day came from, and the honest scholar can only offer theories, each plausible, none proven. What we can say is that the custom is old, documented in various forms since at least the 1500s, and probably a good deal older than that. The most popular explanation involves a change in the calendar, and though historians treat it with real caution, it is a lovely story worth the telling. For much of history, in many places, the New Year was not celebrated on the 1st of January, but in the spring, around the end of March. The spring New Year fell near the 25th of March, and its celebrations often ran on, with feasting and gifts for about a week, ending near the 1st of April. Then, the theory goes, the calendar was reformed, and the official start of the New Year was moved to the 1st of January, where we keep it now. But news travelled slowly in those days, and old habits die hard, and some people either did not hear of the change or simply refused to accept it. These stubborn or ill-informed souls kept celebrating the New Year in the spring, around the 1st of April, as their families always had. And so, the story runs, they became figures of fun, mocked by their more up-to-date neighbours as backward fools who did not know the year had moved. To celebrate the New Year on the 1st of April was to be an April Fool, and playing tricks on such people became the sport of the day. It is a charming explanation, and it may even be partly true, but historians caution that the evidence linking the two is thinner than the story suggests. Others trace the day back to the ancient Roman festival of Hilaria, a spring celebration of rejoicing that involved games, disguises, and merry mockery. Still others see in it a direct descendant of the medieval Feast of Fools, the same old instinct for a licensed day of misrule, simply moved to the spring. Perhaps it is all of these at once, a braid of Roman festival, medieval misrule, and calendar confusion, twisted together over the centuries into a single day. Whatever its roots, the custom took firm hold, and by the 15 and 1600s we find clear references to April fooling across Europe. In France, the day acquired a wonderfully specific form and an equally wonderful, wonderfully specific name of its own, the Poisson d'Avril, the April fish. The classic French prank was, and still is, to secretly attach a paper fish to the back of an unsuspecting victim, then cry poisson d'avril when it is discovered. Quite why a fish, no one is entirely sure, though it may relate to young, foolish fish easily caught in early April, or to older religious symbolism. One of the earliest possible references to the April fish appears in a French poem from the very start of the 1500s, hinting at how old the custom is. From France the fish swam outward, and versions of April fooling spread and mutated across the whole of Europe and eventually the wider world. In Scotland, the day became a 2-day affair, and the fool sent on a pointless errand was called, marvellously, an April gowk, a gowk being a cuckoo. The gowk was sent to deliver a sealed message which, when opened, instructed the reader only to send the poor fool on to yet another person, and so on, endlessly. It is the fool's errand of the Christmas revels, you will notice, reborn in the spring, the same old joke of sending a gull on a pointless quest. And that continuity is the real point, the way the same handful of pranks, the errand, the disguise, the mockery, echo down the centuries in new costumes. Historians still argue over every detail of the day's origins, and it is entirely possible that the true answer is simply lost, dissolved in the mists of time, but perhaps that is fitting. For a festival of foolery to have foolishly mislaid its own birth certificate, leaving us all guessing forever. What matters is what survived. A single day, each year, when the ordinary rules of truth and dignity are gently, playfully suspended by common consent. It is a tiny domesticated descendant of the great medieval seasons of misrule, all that remains in most of our lives of that once mighty tradition. Gone are the mock bishops and the braying masses, the lords of misrule and the masked mummers, shrunk down to a paper fish and a harmless little lie. And yet the spirit is unmistakably the same. The ancient human need for one day, one moment, when we are all allowed to play the fool together. There is something rather beautiful in that survival, in the way this small, stubborn custom has outlived the whole vast medieval world that gave it birth. Every 1st of April, whether we know it or not, we are joining hands across the centuries with the mummers and the fools and the lords of misrule. We are keeping alive, in miniature, the oldest and most human of all the medieval instincts, the deep and stubborn refusal to be entirely serious all the time. But even this gentle survivor was nearly stamped out, along with all its wilder cousins, by a great wave of grim disapproval that we must now briefly confront. All through this long night, we have watched the wild customs of medieval misrule, but we have also watched, gathering at their edges, the forces that would destroy them. We saw the church turn against the Feast of Fools, council by council, decree by decree, over the course of centuries of patient hostility. But the real death blow to the whole world of licensed misrule came from a wider and deeper change, the great upheaval we call the Reformation. When the Protestant reformers broke with the old church, they brought with them a new and fierce vision of what religion and life ought to be. They prized order, sobriety, discipline, and inward seriousness above all, and they looked upon the riotous old festivals with a deep and genuine horror. To a reformer, the Feast of Fools and the Lord of Misrule were not harmless fun, but dangerous relics of superstition, disorder, and ungodliness. And this new severity was not confined to Protestants, for the Catholic Church, reforming itself in response, grew equally hostile to the old excesses. On both sides of the great religious divide, the mood of the age hardened against laughter in sacred places and misrule in the streets. In Scotland, the reforming spirit was especially fierce, driven by stern preachers who saw festive misrule as an offence against a righteous and watchful God. Scotland had its own splendid version of the Lord of Misrule, a figure known by the marvellous title of the Abbot of Unreason. Like his English cousin, the Abbot of Unreason presided over Christmas revels, a lord of holy nonsense crowned to rule over a season of licensed chaos. But to the Scottish reformers, this Abbot of Unreason was an abomination, a mockery of the church dressed up as harmless festive tradition. And so, in the year 1555, the Scottish Parliament passed a law abolishing the Abbot of Unreason, and the disguisings that came with him. It was one of the clearest, most decisive strokes against medieval misrule anywhere. A whole tradition outlawed at a single stroke of the pen. The law forbade the choosing of any Abbot of Unreason, or Queen of the May, or similar figure on pain of real and serious punishment. Yet even a parliament could not simply switch off a custom overnight, and the old traditions lingered stubbornly in the countryside for years. It took decades more and ever harsher measures before the reformers finally succeeded in stamping the last embers of Scottish misrule into the cold ground. In England, the same grim tide rose, and reached its high water mark under the Puritans in the middle of the 1600s. The Puritans, who for a time held real and considerable power in England, disapproved of festivity with a thoroughness that can still astonish us today. They cracked down not only on misrule but on Christmas itself. That whole riotous season of feasting, drinking and disorder they so distrusted. For a few remarkable years, the celebration of Christmas was actually banned in England, its feasting discouraged, its revels suppressed by law. Shops were ordered to stay open on Christmas Day, soldiers took down festive greenery, and the old merry rituals were driven underground or snuffed out. To the Puritan mind, the whole medieval calendar of misrule was a scandal, a survival of paganism and popery that a godly nation could not tolerate. And so, across Protestant Europe, the great old machinery of licensed foolery was dismantled piece by piece, festival by festival, law by law. The mock bishops fell silent, the lords of misrule were uncrowned, the disguisings were banned, and the braying donkeys were led out of the churches for good. Bells that had rung for the Fool's Feast were rehung for solemn service, and the painted saints and merry gargoyles looked down now on a graver, quieter world. A few brave voices spoke up for the old mirth, arguing that a people allowed no festivals would only find worse ways to spend their pent-up spirits. Historians still argue about what was gained and what was lost in this great sobering of the Western world, and it is a genuinely hard question. Something was surely gained. A new seriousness, a new order, a new inwardness that would help give birth to the modern age itself. But something was also lost. A whole shared language of communal, embodied seasonal joy, a permission to be foolish together that we have never quite replaced. The Reformers were not villains. They were sincere people who genuinely believed that reverence and order were worth more than a few days of riot. And they had a real case, for we have seen tonight how easily that riot could curdle into cruelty, into violence and even into treason and murder. But their triumph was also a narrowing, a shutting of a door that had stood open once a year onto a wilder and more playful world. After them, laughter and worship went their separate ways, and the sacred grew solemn, and the festive grew secular, and the two rarely met again. We live still on the far side of that great divide in a world where the church is serious and the carnival is a thing apart. It is hard for us even to imagine the medieval world where the two were one, where you might bray like a donkey in the very act of worship. That world is gone, swept away by the Reformers, surviving only in scattered fragments, in a paper fish, a mummers' play, a pantomime, a carnival parade, and in those fragments, faint but unmistakable, we can still hear the distant echo of the great medieval seasons of misrule calling across the centuries. But before we gather up the threads of our long night, let us return one last time to the ordinary people and the small, kind pranks of everyday life. For amid all the grand tales of kings and councils, jesters and conspiracies, there was always a quieter, gentler stream of simple, harmless human fun. So come down, one last time, from the throne rooms and the cathedrals, from the plots and the riots, into the warm, ordinary heart of medieval life. For most people, most of the time, a prank was not a matter of kings or councils, but simply a way to pass a long evening with a laugh. A good practical joke, well told and well timed, could make a man's reputation in his village, remembered and retold for years around the winter fire. And riddles too were a gentle sort of trick, little verbal traps that snared the unwary listener into a foolish answer and a burst of laughter. The medieval world was, for all its hardships, a deeply social one, lived shoulder to shoulder in cramped houses, crowded taverns and busy market squares, and in that close-packed world, teasing, joking and playful trickery were the small change of daily life, the mortar between the bricks of friendship. Take the apprentices, the young lads bound for years to a master craftsman to learn a trade, sleeping under his roof and eating at his table. Their lives were hard and their hours long, but they found time, as young people always do, for mischief at one another's expense. A favourite trick, ancient even then and still played today, was to send the newest apprentice off to fetch some impossible tool. He would be sent to another workshop for a left-handed hammer, a tin of elbow grease, a bucket of steam, or a long wait, spelled W-E-I-G-H-T. The poor boy would trudge from master to master, each of whom, in on the joke, would gravely send him on to the next, and the next. It is the fool's errand again, you see, the same joke we met in the Christmas hall and the April fooling, worn smooth by centuries of use. The tavern, too, was a natural home for pranks, where ale loosened tongues and sharpened the appetite for a bit of harmless mischief. Dice and card games shaded easily into cheating and counter-cheating, into elaborate wind-ups and long, patient practical jokes played over many nights. There were drinking games of fiendish complexity, with forfeits for those who fumbled the words or the actions, ending in laughter and spilled ale. Weddings were another great occasion for licensed mischief, when the whole community turned out to tease the newlyweds with rough good humour. We have met the gentler charivari already, the friendly racket outside the marriage bed, all noise and laughter and cheerful, boisterous embarrassment. Young men might block the couple's door, hide away all their belongings, or fill their new marriage bed with an assortment of unexpected and uncomfortable surprises. It was all part of the ritual, a way for the community to mark the great change with laughter, and to remind the couple they belonged to everyone. The great fairs and holy days brought their own pranks, when crowds gathered from miles around and the ordinary rules relaxed for a day. There were games of skill and chance, contests and dares, and tricksters working the crowd, some in good fun and some rather less so. And there was Hocktide, a curious custom of the days after Easter, when the playful battle of the sexes was acted out in the streets. On one day, the women of the village would capture the men, binding them with ropes and refusing to release them until a small ransom was paid. On the next day, the men would return the favour, capturing the women in their turn, all in good humour, the ransoms going to the parish funds. It was mischief with a purpose, a prank that doubled as a fundraiser. The laughter of the whole village turned to the good of the church roof. Historians still argue about how these customs worked and what they meant, but their spirit is clear enough. Play, community, and a gentle turning of the tables. For notice how many of these everyday pranks, like the grand festivals, turned on the same beloved idea of reversal, of the world turned briefly upside down. The apprentice fools the master, the women capture the men, the servant wears the crown, and for a moment the ordinary order of things is playfully overturned. This, more than any single joke, is the deep pattern beneath all medieval mischief, the delicious, temporary inversion of the everyday world. It is why the servant becomes king at Christmas, why the boy becomes bishop, why the whole rigid ladder of medieval life could, for a season, be flipped. And it is why, when the joke was over, everyone returned so willingly to their places, for the reversal only made sense against the order it briefly suspended. The prank, in other words, was not really a rebellion against the order of things, but a strange, sideways way of affirming it. By turning the world upside down for a day, medieval people reminded themselves, and each other, exactly which way up it was meant to be. There is a deep wisdom in that, a recognition that rules we can never escape become unbearable, but rules we can escape just briefly, we can happily bear. The prank was the safety valve, the pressure release, the little rebellion that made the great obedience of ordinary life possible year after year. And most of the time, blessedly, it worked, and the laughter stayed laughter, and the servant went back to his master with a lighter heart. It is only when the valve failed, when the pressure escaped all at once, that misrule became mayhem, and the joke became the tragedy. But those failures, dramatic as they are, were the exception, and we should not let them blind us to the vast quiet ocean of harmless medieval fun. For every riot and every plot, there were 10,000 evenings of apprentices laughing, of newlyweds blushing, of friends teasing friends by the fire, and it is that gentler music, not the darker one, that we should carry with us as our long night begins at last to draw toward its close. We have travelled a long way tonight, from a slap on a king's backside to a plot to murder one, and it is worth pausing to ask what all of it really means. Why did medieval people prank so much and so elaborately? And why did they build whole festivals and seasons around the simple act of turning things upside down? Scholars who study these customs have offered many answers over the years, and the most powerful of them circle around a single deep idea. Some see in these festivals a wild echo of far older pre-Christian rites. Others see a purely social invention. Most see a tangle of both grown together. That idea is release, the notion that any society which binds its people tightly must also, somehow, give them a way to let the pressure out. Medieval life was bound very tightly indeed, by rank, by custom, by the church, by the sheer grinding necessity of survival in a hard world. Almost everyone was somebody's subject, somebody's servant, or somebody's inferior, expected to bow to obey and to know their proper place from cradle to grave. A life like that, lived without any relief, would be unbearable, a pressure building year after year with no way ever to escape. And so, the theory goes, the festivals of misrule were the escape, the pressure valve built deliberately into the machine of medieval society. For a few days a year, the servant could mock the master, the poor could ape the rich, and the powerless could taste briefly what power felt like. Having tasted it, and laughed, and let off steam, they could then return to their ordinary places, refreshed and, crucially, obedient once more. It is a compelling idea, and there is surely a great deal of truth in it, for we feel the same need for release in our own lives today. But some scholars push back hard, arguing that the safety valve theory is far too neat, too comfortable, and too eager to make all misrule harmless. For if misrule was only ever a release valve, why did the authorities fear it so much and ban it so often and stamp it out so hard? Perhaps, they suggest, the festivals were not only a release but also a rehearsal, a yearly reminder that the world could, in fact, be otherwise. Every time a servant wore the crown, he learned in his body that the master was not a god but a man, and that crowns could be worn by anyone. And that knowledge, once tasted, is dangerous, for a people who can imagine the world turned upside down can begin to wonder why it is not. Historians still argue fiercely between these two views, misrule as safety valve and misrule as rehearsal for revolt, and the truth is probably both at once. The very same festival could soothe one man into contentment and stir another toward rebellion, depending on what he brought to it and took away. That double nature, soothing and dangerous at once, is perhaps the deepest truth about the whole world of medieval pranks and misrule. It runs right through everything we have seen tonight, through the jester's joke and the carnival mask and the village rough music alike. The prank is always double. It is play and it is power, it is release and it is rehearsal, it is the safety valve and the spark, and which of those it becomes depends, in the end, not on the joke itself but on the hearts of the people who tell it and hear it. The same slap can be an affectionate tease or a deadly insult. The same mask can hide a laughing neighbour or a waiting assassin. This is why the line we have traced all night between the harmless prank and the harmful one can never be drawn once and for all. It must be drawn again and again in every joke by every person in the fleeting moment between the impulse and the act. The medieval world understood this better than we sometimes do, which is why it wrapped its pranks so carefully in ritual, season and custom. The costume, the calendar, the appointed lord of misrule, all of these were fences, ways of saying this far and no further, this is play and not war. And when those fences held, the fun was glorious, a genuine release of joy that bound a community together in shared, forgiving laughter. When they broke, the results were the riots and the plots and the tragedies we have also seen, the dark shadow cast by the very same light. Perhaps that is the truest lesson of this long, strange history, that laughter and cruelty are not opposites but neighbours, born from the very same impulse. The urge to turn the world upside down can lift a downtrodden heart, or it can crush a chosen victim, and often it is a hair's breadth between the two. To laugh at the powerful is one of the most human and most healthy things we do, a way of cutting the mighty down to a bearable size. But to laugh at the weak, the different, the isolated is one of the cruelest, a way of grinding the helpless further down into the dirt. The medieval prank contained both of these possibilities at once, the noble and the base, forever braided together and forever impossible to fully separate. And so, in the end, the history of medieval pranks is really a history of ourselves, of the light and the dark that live together in every laugh. We are not so different from those distant people, banging their pots and wearing their masks and crowning their fools in the deep of winter. We carry the same impulses, the same need for release, the same capacity for both healing laughter and cruel mockery, into our own bright, busy age, and understanding them, these laughing, dangerous, deeply human ancestors of ours, may help us understand a little better the laughter in our own hearts tonight. Before we let the night close over us entirely, let us gather up the threads of our long journey and ask what became of all this laughter. For the medieval world of misrule, though the reformers did their best to bury it, did not truly die. It only scattered and hid and quietly survived. Look closely at our own calendar, and you will find its fingerprints everywhere, faint but unmistakable, if you only know how to look. Look, too, at the roast, that fond ritual where friends gather to mock a guest of honour to his face, and he must sit and take it, laughing. We have already met the clearest survivor, the 1st of April, when the ancient licence to fool one another briefly returns to the whole world. But there are others too, older and far stranger, hiding in plain sight among the many festivals we still faithfully keep without quite knowing why. Think of Carnival, that great explosion of masks and feasting and misrule that still fills the streets of cities from Venice to Rio each year. It is the direct descendant of the medieval pre-Lenten revels, the same wild farewell to the flesh before the long fast unbroken across the centuries. The masks of the Venice Carnival, the floats of the great parades, the crowning of mock kings and queens, all of it flows from that same ancient spring. Think of Halloween, with all its costumes and its masks, its children going merrily from door to door, half threatening in exchange for sweets and treats. In it you can hear a clear echo of the mummers, those masked and costumed visitors who came knocking through the medieval winter dark. Think of the pantomime still performed across Britain each and every Christmas, with its cross-dressing dames, its topsy-turvy plots, and its cheerful, rowdy misrule. It is the Lord of Misrule and the Feast of Fools, tamed and dressed for children, but recognisably the same old spirit of festive inversion. Think even of the office Christmas party, that strange annual ritual where, for one night, the ordinary rules of the workplace are suspended. The boss serves the drinks, the juniors speak too freely, the hierarchy is playfully overturned, and everyone agrees next morning to forget what was said. If that is not a small secular feast of fools, a modern Lord of Misrule in a paper hat, then it is very hard to say what else it could be. The impulse, you see, never died. It simply changed its clothes, slipping out of the cathedral and into the carnival, the party and the playground. And the great figures we have met tonight still walk among us too, in disguises we barely recognise as we pass them by. The court jester lives on in the stand-up comedian, licensed, like the fool of old, to mock the powerful and say the unsayable to laughing crowds. The satirist who lampoons a president or a prime minister is Triboulet, needling the king, protected now not by a cap and bells but by the freedom of the press. The trickster lives on in every prankster and every hoax, in the elaborate practical jokes we still play and still secretly admire. And the darker figures survive too, the mob that turns on a chosen victim, the cruelty that still hides so comfortably inside collective laughter. For the shadow side we trace tonight has not vanished any more than the light. Both still live in us, woven together as tightly as ever. When a crowd turns its mockery on a single soul, hunting them for sport, that is the charivari, reborn, its rough music playing on new instruments. When laughter is used to shame the weak rather than to humble the strong, the oldest and ugliest kind of prank is being played once again. So the medieval world is not, after all, so very far away. It is here, in our festivals and our jokes, our kindness and our cruelty alike. We are still the same creatures who crowned the Bean King and brayed in the cathedral, still torn between the healing laugh and the wounding one. And perhaps there is comfort in that, in knowing that our struggles with laughter are old and shared and deeply, unchangeably human. The medieval people were not wiser than us, nor more foolish. They were simply us in different clothes, wrestling with the very same bright and dangerous gift. They knew, as we are still learning, that laughter can build a community or break a heart, can lift the fallen or grind them down, and they tried, with their seasons and their rituals and their gentle appointed fools, to keep that great power pointed as much as they could toward joy. They did not always succeed, as we have seen, and neither, if we are honest, do we, for the old temptations are with us still. But the effort itself, the ancient stubborn effort to laugh together kindly, is one of the most hopeful things about our strange and struggling species. So when next you play a harmless prank, or laugh with friends until you ache, or forgive a joke that stung, remember that you are keeping an old faith. You are joining a line that stretches back through the centuries, through the pranksters and the fools, all the way to a torchlit medieval hall. And when you feel the pull toward the other kind of laughter, the cruel kind, the kind aimed at the weak, remember the shadow we have traced tonight. Remember that the mask can hide an assassin, that the rough music can end in blood, and choose as best you can the gentler music instead. That is the small, quiet wisdom I would send you off to sleep with, gathered from all these long-dead, laughing, deeply human ancestors of ours. And now, at last, the tale is told, the lesson gently offered, and there is nothing left but to let the whole, warm world of it dissolve softly into rest. And so our long night's journey through the laughter of the Middle Ages comes softly now to its end, and it is time to let it all gently go. Let the kings and the jesters fade, the mock bishops and the braying donkeys, the masked mummers and the pot-banging crowds, all of them drifting slowly into the dark. Let poor Triboulet take his final bow and slip away, his wit at last at rest, his long night over, his laughter fading into a soft and distant hush. Let the great fires burn down to embers, the halls grow quiet, the candles gutter low, and the whole warm, noisy, laughing medieval world settle into sleep. There is nothing left now for you to do. No more roads to walk, no more tales to follow, only the soft and welcome business of letting yourself rest. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders gently, like a heavy cloak set down at last beside a warm and glowing hearth. Let your breathing slow, and soften, and deepen, each breath a little quieter than the one before, carrying you further from the cares of the waking world. The fools have finished their capering, the bells have stilled, the masks are laid aside, and all across that old and distant world the lights are going out. You have nothing to carry with you but a small warm smile and the quiet knowledge that people have always laughed, even in the hardest and coldest of times. So let that gentle thought be the last one tonight, and let it warm you as you sink down softly into the deep and welcoming dark of sleep. Rest now. The night is long and kind and yours. Close your eyes, breathe slow and drift away, and I will see you gently in the morning.